It's a trivial and pretty obvious fact that the world has changed more in the last 30 years than any 30-year period in the past. Most of this is because of technology. I spend my days in ways that would have seemed magical to me when I was a kid. If you told the teenage Amit of the 1980s and 90s that I would one day be able to read any book in the world, listen to any song, watch any movie, I would have called that utopian. Indeed, what I am doing now would have seemed impossible. Speaking into a mic in my own home to be heard all across the world. Indeed, to be heard by you right now. It's amazing how we take so much of this for granted. Every new advance gets normalized in terms of the quality of the lives we live, in terms of eradicating poverty, in terms of empowering marginalized groups. There's just been progress, progress, progress. And yet, in at least one domain, it sometimes seems that we have gone backwards. When the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Berlin Wall fell, it seemed like the long arc of history was finally on the path to freedom and nothing could stop it. But alas, there seems to have been a reversal of this in recent years. Globalization is under danger of receding. Statism is the dominant political philosophy, and populists are on the rise everywhere. Tribalism is back, not just in terms of which football club you support, but in terms of the othering of entire groups of people, of bigotry based on how one happens to be born. And this is across the political spectrum as our discourse gets more and more polarized and shrill. How on earth did we get here?
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Shikha Dalmia, a legendary columnist in the US who had long-running columns in Reason magazine and The Week that I have been reading for maybe 20 years now. Shikha and I first met probably 10-15 years ago. I don't exactly remember when. And at that time, we'd have referred to each other as libertarian, believing in individual freedom across all domains, in the bedroom, in the marketplace, at the public square. Today, we both hesitate to use that label, not because our values have changed, but because labels always give way to tribalism. As our politics went to hell in the last 10 years, as the derangements of both the right and the left swept individual freedom aside, the way people behaved often had no connection with the original meaning of the labels they laid claim to. Liberals weren't liberal. Conservatives adopted radical ideas, and libertarians turned away from freedom. A mess all around. During this time, Shikha was aghast at how Donald Trump came up and took over the Republican Party while standing for values every Reaganite Republican would have considered abhorrent. She decided that she had to fight against Trump, and not just Trump, but this revival of populism. And writing columns wasn't enough. Last year, Shikha started the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, and she also launched a magazine on Substack called the Unpopulist. Both of them have gained much traction, and she organized a conference about the future of liberalism in July this year in Washington, D.C., to which I was invited. I stayed back a few days after that and managed to get around 3 hours of Shikha's time for this episode. There's tons of insight here as Shikha breaks down populism, explains the shape of the new Republican Party, and shares her insights on what is happening in America today. The US presidential elections come around in just a few days, and when you listen to this conversation, I think you'll agree with Shikha that the stakes are high. But before you start listening, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their daily reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Shikha, welcome to the Scene and the Unseen.
Thank you for having me, Amit. It's a real pleasure. I've been a fan of this podcast, and I really wish there were 36 hours in the day so that I could listen to all your episodes.
No, you're much too kind, and there is a way to make days longer if the only purpose of a day was to listen to an episode, which is you can listen to it at higher speeds. So you pack more days into. You've been on the show before, back in the day, a wonderful episode about immigration, something both of us care about, open borders, and so on. And in those days, the podcast was very different, much smaller, both in length and scope and reach. I sometimes think about the last few years, and it feels like that there's been a huge glitch in the matrix, in the sense that if we were living in a simulation, something went wrong with the programming, some bug got in, and the world just went to hell because nothing seems to make sense, right?
Yes.
A few years ago, it would have been unimaginable for me that Donald Trump is going to be, the president of the USA, or a lot of the stuff that happened all across the world, not just in India, but all across the world. This rise of populism, somehow, I don't think any of us bought the whole end of history thing that, okay, liberal democracy is won forever. And even Fukuyama didn't exactly mean exactly that. I think there were nuances that people ignored. But the turn that the world has taken in the last few years is incredibly bizarre and unexpected. So, what's sort of your sense of that when you look back in the last few years? Like, in terms of the why is populism so incredibly popular again when you would have imagined that the internet will just make us one global family, right?
Yeah, it's a very big question, Amit, and I've been grappling with it now for at least 3 years, right, or 4 years on my own, in my own capacity as kind of like founding this entire institute called the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism. Before that, I was a columnist at Reason and The Week, and I was kind of like grappling with this. I don't know if I have any good answer as to why the world has gone crazy suddenly. There are minds far greater than mine who are sort of trying to understand the underlying forces, the sociological forces, the political forces, all of those that have suddenly come to a head. I just feel like I'm personally going crazy over here. I watched the rise of Modi in India. In what was it? He got elected in 2014, but he had thrown his bid for the prime ministership like a year earlier, and I just thought, like, this man who had presided over this, really ugly, nasty, violent episode of anti-Muslim violence in his state could never get elected Prime Minister of India, right? And then he managed to completely rewrite the narrative about him and amass what seemed like a cult following, right? Strongman appeal, and how he could change the whole moral landscape around him was mind-boggling to me. And I thought this could never happen in the United States, right? Like, I thought, okay, India, there's a lot of unworked history from the time of partition. The founders glossed over too many social tensions, when they wrote the Constitution. The many liberal democratic institutions hadn't really taken firm hold in India, even though it was not an immature democracy. I mean, it was already about whatever, 70 years at that point. So I just thought, okay, India has its issues, but it's an anomaly, and it could never happen in the United States, right? I literally thought America, this was a country that was founded on a commitment to certain liberal democratic principles. I mean, they are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, they are enshrined in the Constitution, and there is a vocabulary over here in this country, right? Like, to discuss and that forms the terms of our discussion, right? There is a strong streak against tyranny in this country. This country was founded in opposition to tyranny, and its institutions are checks and balances and representative government and, courts and the press, the fierce commitment to free speech. It's meant to contain tyranny and a tyrant, right? So I thought this can never happen over here. And then Trump came, and lo and behold, not only did he get elected, it was a squeaker of an election, okay, fine, but still he got elected, which means close to 50% of the country voted for him. But then, you know, people whom I never thought would ever fall in his way kind of slowly started succumbing. I actually wrote a piece on Eugene Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, which is in the absurdist tradition. It's sort of a metaphor for how people fell to the sway of fascism. I mean, he was from Romania and he saw he was a writer over there. He worked for this newspaper, which was staunchly against fascist ideology. And then slowly the editor became a fascist and all his friends became fascists and everybody around him became a fascist. And he couldn't understand it at any kind of like a rational level. So he wrote this absurdist play where some people around him start becoming rhinoceroses. I mean, like literally they become rhinoceros. And these rhinoceros, it's a metaphor for kind of like the trampling of civilization, these big, ugly beasts who stand for no civility are somehow, taking over the world. Well, I won't get into Ionesco's play too deeply. So my point is that you can't, sometimes I feel you can't understand this phenomenon at a rational level. You just have to kind of get your, head around it based on certain kind of absurdist thinking that Ionesco typified, which is don't try to understand it, just observe it and describe it in the words that you have, in the art forms that are available to you. And so to some extent, that's kind of what I've been doing, is just trying to describe it and even not really understand it. So I don't know, very long-winded response, but I don't know if I have any good answers for why populism is taking over the world. Why people are succumbing. I know it's happening.
So I feel like I obviously understand India much better than the US. So let me talk a little bit about India and come to a question about the US on the same margins. When I think of India today, I think that there are three problems that worry me. And one is a proximate problem, but two are deeper problems. The proximate problem is I don't like the party in power. You and I happen to agree on that, but I think it's reasonable to disagree on that. But it's a proximate problem. To me, it's the smallest of the problems. There are two larger problems. One larger problem is the design of our state, which is designed from the top down to be oppressive, and the balance between the state and society is much different than what it is in the US. The state essentially is a hangover of the colonial state. It is designed to rule us, to suppress us. People are treated more like subjects and citizens. That's one issue, and part of it comes from circumstances, in the sense that, when America had its founding, if you look at the circumstances of the founding, it is natural both that individual rights would be at the center of it and that federalism would be a key part of both the political culture and the constitutional design. So that's one worry that I have, the power that the state has. The second worry is society itself. I think that we live in a deeply fractured society. I believe that this is not something new. I grew up, I realize, in an English speaking elite bubble in India, and my imagination was that we are broadly secular, we are broadly tolerant, all of that. And it is true. About India, of course, Joan Robinson said, whatever you say, the opposite is also true. So it is true. But equally, it is a case that I was a fringe. It was a bubble. The nation wasn't like that. I did this, perhaps the episode of mine which really brought it home to me, and everything else since then has reinforced that, was an episode I did with Akshay Mukul, who wrote a great book on the Gita Press, on how well they did with their books, which are not just books like the Ramcharitmanas and whatever, which are fine. You sell 80 million copies, that's great. But also books on how women should behave and their places in the kitchen and all of those things, all those terrible things. And reading that also made me look a little bit at the political history of pre-independent India and realize that a lot of the live issues of today were issues in the 1920s. Love jihad, cow slaughter. All of these anti-Muslim issues were issues back then. That there has been a consistent anti-Muslim strain that has run through Indian society. And in that regard, often our constitution, even though you and I would feel it is not liberal enough, is actually much more liberal than society itself. It was a relatively liberal constitution imposed on an illiberal society, and there's something there to think about. And I think Gandhiji got it partly right where or right definitely in this margin where he said that true change will happen from the bottom up. You cannot impose it from the top down. And I think we failed there. So, therefore, when I look at 2014 and the 10 years since with that lens, I think that, look, politics caught up with society. We were always like this. We ignored it at our own peril. And therefore, it was already a deep rooted problem. And once Modi came to power, like essentially most prime ministers before him, he used the power of the state to get his political way. You know, a lot of the political prisoners that he locked up, like Arun Ferreira and so on, had been locked up before. Arun Ferreira, in fact, wrote a book about being locked up by the UPA. A lot of the laws under which he's locking people up either existed from British times and were never removed, or were brought up by the previous UPA government. So these are deep problems, the state and society. I want to figure out if there is something about America that explains Trump, because I feel like I can explain Modi through this. That our society was like this, number one, and two, there are incentives to oppression. Once you are in power, you legitimately, according to the constitution, you can use the state power. What's the scene with America? Like, culturally, my naive impression from a distance would have been that individual liberty is so much at the heart of this nation, and that there is no strain that leads to any kind of fascism or dictatorship or whatever. It's just utterly alien. That's what I would see from the outside in my little simplistic way. What's your sense of that? Like, is this really out of the blue? Is it something that's not rooted either in American society or the Constitution? And perhaps this kind of tribalism is hardwired into us, so human nature is where this comes from? Or is it the case that it's not as incoherent as it seems, that there were strains of this sort before that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think the big difference between the Indian constitution and the approach to government and state power and the American is that in India, the state was always considered sort of a benign institution, that you could use the state to do good. There wasn't a built-in sort of understanding about the problem of the state in the Indian constitution, right? It was just another tool to accomplish social ends. Whereas in America, there's been this tradition that the state is a very double-edged sword. If you empower it to do good, it can also use that power to do bad. And that's been very endemic in American thinking, which is why you would have thought that when a statist like Trump, who actually worships state power, I mean, he venerates state, he wants to be the state and he wants to wield all the power of the state through him, you would think that there would be this, rise, of protest against him, and he wouldn't get anywhere. I mean, forget protest. You would think a man like that could never get traction in the United States, right? He is so at odds with American traditions. That was kind of like my thinking pre-Trump. And after Trump came, I mean, it forced me to rethink so many assumptions about this country, right? And I think he hasn't arisen in a vacuum. Now, I don't think he needed to arise, because there's always something contingent about these big historical moments. And I don't think if he had not arisen at the time he had, America would have necessarily gone in this way. There was nothing inevitable. On the other hand, he was also not sui generis. I mean, there were unworked out tensions in India, right? Like some of which you described. This country has been on a dual track and actually Zach Beecham, who is at Vox, he's just written this book called The Reactionary Spirit. And I think that kind of like best summarizes the duality in America. I mean, there is this American exceptionalism, right? Like this shining city on the hill, which Reagan talked about, this beacon of liberalism and liberty, and, you leave individuals free and they can accomplish miracles, and all you have to do is give them the room and the space to accomplish their personal life projects, right? And so what liberty can accomplish? You throw the yoke of tradition, oppression of the state, and you release individuals to perform all kinds of miracles. And I think that's part of America's story. That's the story of, I hate to put it in racial terms, but that's the story of white America and also immigrants in America. It is not the story of Black America. At the same time that America was, mounting a revolution in the name of freedom, it was also doubling down on slavery at the same time. And Samuel Johnson, who was this English poet at the time of American Revolution, I mean, he said something very interesting. He said, why do something like, and there's not an exact quote, why do the loudest yelps of freedom come from the biggest slave drivers? And so there was this tradition in America that there were, sort of like a dominant class, which happened to be the white class. I don't want to racialize this too much, that wanted freedom, but freedom to oppress. And those traditions were simultaneously working their way. And I mean, one of the interesting facts about American history is that, even as whites were getting suffrage, like, initially white men, only the property holding white men got, the right to vote. But then, non-property holding white men also got the right to vote. At the same time that, whites were moving towards greater freedom, the institution of slavery in America, this is after the revolution, after the invention of the cotton gin, which was around like the early 19th century, slavery was becoming worse in this country. There were more slaves in this country. Chattel slavery, which is essentially, you have blacks are just treated as property who can be divided and disposed of any way you see fit. That became more intense after the revolution. So whereas the experience for the white dominant class were more freedom, the experience for blacks was authoritarianism. I mean, there's no other word for it. I mean, it was really, draconian authoritarianism that blacks were living under. And I think that duality to some extent is still being worked out, that America has also is, and this is the part that Zach draws out in his book. He said that, America has had lessons for the world on liberal democracy, but it has also had lessons for the world on illiberal democracy, in the sense that the oppression of blacks at the time after the revolution till the Civil War happened was being done through democratic means, using the language of freedom. So I think some of that is being worked out now. What Trump did now, if you fast forward now to the middle of the 20th century, you have the rise of the civil rights movement over here. After slavery was abolished in the middle of the 19th century, then you had 100 years of Jim Crow. There is a huge civil rights movement that has emerged. You end Jim Crow. But the ending of Jim Crow also spawned certain, majoritarian backlash in this country. And various strains of the right emerged to deal with that backlash. And I don't think that, to some extent, the dominant white classes completely got used to the shift in status that would be, involved in completely giving up their power and acknowledging the, sort of the rights of, not just like fully acknowledging the rights of blacks and even women. And I think that tension is still working out. So there was all this unworked out tension Trump came and capitalized on and exploited. He's used immigration as a proxy for it, because it's still politically incorrect to go, to make this about sort of like the racial dynamic. So he's used immigration as a proxy, but it all comes to sort of this unworked out tension in in America between freedom for one class of people and oppression for another class of people, but also this oppression in the name of freedom.
Something that I think took me by surprise over the last 10 years, that disillusioned me and disheartened me greatly, and I know it's the same with you, is something that is also part of this narrative. Like when you speak about, the founders of the nation having certain principles which they espoused, but not for everyone. And that but is really interesting. It makes me think about sort of the unspoken and unexpressed hypocrisies that lie within many expressions of principles. Like what I have seen happen over the last 10 years is that many people who I thought were principled weren't actually principled, they were tribal,
Yeah.
right? So they would espouse certain packages of principles because it gave them membership to a particular tribe, and they were like, yeah, I am so and so, and you can feel virtuous and knowledgeable in that membership. But they turned away from it so fast.
Yeah.
And that's happened both in America and India. In India, there were many people who in 2014 supported Modi, saying that, hey, we need free markets and we need, etc., etc. And I never supported him, but I can understand that, okay, at
Yeah.
least that is a reasonable reason that after, however, they should have changed their mind within months, if not within weeks of his coming to power, because it was obvious that A, he was incredibly statist, and B, the social agenda soon got into place. And by the time demonetization happened, it was completely obvious that this guy is worse than anyone who came before,
Yes.
right? And they didn't. And they didn't. And there were people who I respected, who I think I learned from, who wrote columns supporting demonetization, in fact, which is just so mind blowing to me. And at that time, in fact, I remember writing in an editorial for a magazine I used to edit that any economist who supports demonetization is either a bad economist or a bad human being. And and many were perhaps both, but that's besides the point. And you've seen the same thing happen in America. And like, what's that process been like? Because it is a personal loss at some sense.
Oh, yeah.
Because you think about the stuff that you believe in.
Yeah.
Like as far as I am concerned, the facts of the world change all the time. I'm open to being corrected. I'm open to changing my mind. The values I'm dogmatic about, these are the values I have, and I will, and I know you're the same. And I assumed that people who pay allegiance to any kinds of values, are like that.
Yeah.
Whether their values I agree with or not doesn't really matter. You can have left-right distinction. It doesn't really matter. My default good faith assumption always is that you believe in what you say you believe in. And over the last 10 years, it's like, what on earth happened?
Yeah.
How has that process been for you personally, kind of coming to terms with that? What have you seen in the landscape around you?
I mean, it's been very discombobulating, right? It's just, like I said, I come from like sort of the libertarian tradition, right? Really think that still do in that sense that the central problem of politics is what to do about the state. How do you use the state to perform certain basic functions but not get oppressive, by itself. And that whole sort of the constitutional scheme of checks and balances and limited government and a restrained executive, all of that is kind of what had motivated me for all of my career. And I also, I've been a writer in this country since like 1995 when I first started on the editorial board of the Detroit News, which was a conservative libertarian paper, right? The Detroit Free Press was the liberal paper, and the Detroit News was the conservative libertarian paper. I firmly, having lived through the experience of socialism in India, was very much like a free market, advocate, and still am, right? There were so many, other fundamental issues of liberal democracies that I just took for granted. I thought, of course, we'll be toleration, for instance, and commitment to toleration, commitment to certain kind of pluralism, certain kind of, freedom of conscience, all of that. I just kind of like decency, humanity, just a humane country, humane society, just the very bedrock commitments of liberalism. I never thought I had to fight for, because I thought I just took them for granted, right? I was fighting for those things that were not taken for granted. Markets, even though, this country is free market, but there was always a challenge from the left to markets, right? There was too much regulation, too much taxation, always the allure of like redistributive policies to accomplish ends that can't be accomplished, not sufficient attention to the unintended consequences of, noble sounding, policies. That's what I was focused on, right? And then Trump happened, and I thought, okay, my God, like this man is, he speaks in a different language. He's attacking some fundamental values of liberalism and fundamental institutions of liberalism, and everybody will pivot. everybody, they'll see that this guy, he's attacking immigrants in these, really nasty terms, dehumanizing them in the same way that Amit Shah actually learned from Donald Trump. Immigration never used to be an issue in India. It became an issue post-Trump, right? And Trump kind of got the ball rolling on that when he called Mexicans criminals, rapists, and just described them in this unrecognizable language. And I just thought this is such a fundamental challenge to, our basic concepts of liberal toleration that everybody on my side is just going to pivot and oppose this man. Lo and behold, in my view, libertarians who were put on this planet to resist tyranny and tyrants just kind of looked at him and said, no big deal. And they started and this happened in India too, which is why this is, sort of like this both-sidism. Well, yeah, Modi is bad, but Congress is no better, right? And the whataboutery that, Trump is doing that, but look that far back in history, if you look at Woodrow Wilson, he was a, terrible progressive, and he believed in eugenics, and he believed in all of that. So this kind of this vocabulary, instead of developing a new vocabulary to understand this new threat that we were facing, they, a whole new vocabulary emerged of both-sidism and whataboutism in our, among people whom I would have least suspected. So to some extent, I just feel that I have to take back this side and reorient it and try and get it to see that, try and remind it of its more fundamental commitments, right? Not just see the world through whether or not, Trump is less free market than Joe Biden, but which one of them is, who is more in tune with certain bedrock liberal commitments and values, who is going to tear the social, who is, running on a message of unity, and who is running on a message of us versus them, right? Which is what Trump is doing. So I feel like we just have to go back to the basics now and re-excavate a commitment to certain core values before we start talking about policy issues, before we start thrashing out our disagreements about how much welfare state we want and how much we don't want, how much regulation, what kind of tax policies, what should the marginal tax rates be. Before we start thrashing all those disagreements, we just need to go back and stabilize the basic institutions and values of liberalism, which we somehow seem to have lost sight of. And I think on our side, because we just became too complacent and started taking them for granted in this country. We thought certain battles had been won.
About whataboutery, I always say that whataboutery is always an admission of defeat. Because instead of saying, no, we didn't do that, you say, hey, but what about that? The other guy is also bad. In the wonderful conference you held recently, there was a panel where Azhar Nafizi said something really interesting about Iran.
Yeah.
And she said that, look, in Iran, the language of liberalism is a natural language of the opposition because there is no choice.
Yeah.
When you face that kind of oppression,
Yeah.
where it is existential,
Yeah.
you will, of course, speak in terms of freedom. You have no choice.
Yeah.
And everything is boiled down to its essence. And my sense of America and my sense of a lot of elite India is that we have lost track of that. We got complacent. We achieved a lot of the things we wanted to achieve. Certainly among the elites in India and large parts of America that I see, there's no existential threat to you. So you can, go into other luxury beliefs, as it were, and you don't have to stress out over the basic foundational quality of the importance of freedom itself and those basic core foundational values.
Yes.
Is that the case? Have you seen that? Do you think that these conversations all became drawing room conversations because there was nothing at stake? Like when you talk of freedom in America, like say 15 years ago, there's not really so much at stake.
Yeah.
And therefore that intensity and the clarity isn't there. Is that the case?
Yes. To a very large extent. Actually, there was another panel we held at this conference, which was a breakout panel, which was about liberalism and social justice, right? And this panel, the conversation we were having was that, if you look at America, the promise of liberty and liberalism has been advanced by the founding generation. But every major stride towards freedom and the kinds of values that we believe in has actually come through minority struggle, right? I mean, it was, blacks, horrendous, conditions during slavery that led to the abolitionist movement, right? It was black demands. I mean, Frederick Douglass, sort of one of the most eloquent Americans who has ever lived, right? The only rival I could think is maybe Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it was their struggle of oppression that forced America to be true to its promise of liberty for all, right? And it was the same in after during the Jim Crow generation. So I feel it's kind of like a sad paradoxical reality, but oppression is what leads to the struggle for liberation. If you don't have oppression, you can't have a struggle for liberation. And so the promise of liberalism can only be in some ways advanced by minorities, right? Like who are feeling the boot of the state and the rest of society. And so Azhar's point that the language of liberation and liberty is meant for minorities suffering oppression, right? Like the groups suffering oppression. And they don't actually always have to be minorities. I mean, the state can oppress majorities too, as it's doing in Iran. I mean, women are not a minority in Iran. They're 50% of the population, but they are being oppressed. So it's usually, it's the oppressed, but especially oppressed minorities who need the language of liberation and liberty more than anybody else. And all the major advances in liberty and, liberation come from that struggle, which is why I think it is such a mistake in this country, and I think in India, to demonize the struggle of these, of these groups. I mean, whether it is Muslims or Dalits in India, to try and turn this into either a class or a caste or whatever, to try and turn the just demands of these groups into something nefarious without simply critiquing whether or not their means are appropriate, right? Whether their means are liberal or not. And I think to some extent that's the reason for Trump's rise, is that you had the rise of, of a left that was quite progressive, that wanted to, in a very, very vociferous way, advocate for the rights of, women, minorities, blacks in this country, right? Which led to some extent, I think, led to the backlash through the rise of Trumpism and the MAGA movement. But you can take issue with many of their tactics, right? Like the whole, much of it is exaggerated. This whole thing about cancel culture and political correctness is to some extent exaggerated, but to the extent that it was true, they could have simply taken issue with the means that the left was using. That's not what they did. They want to just completely discredit even the goals of social justice, even the aims of simple things like, women face all kinds of harassment in the workplace, or if not harassment, then inequality in the workplace. The left has done us a great service by pointing out some of like the deep structures, that exist even when you have formal equality, that are still, pushing against, real advancement or the issues that women have to deal with. But there's just an effort on the right to just completely discredit them. And they use the language of liberalism to discredit it, right? So that's kind of where it becomes dangerous, where you use the language of liberalism to discredit some very, very legitimate liberal issues and demands on the part of people who don't naturally benefit from, from those commitments.
I think it's a fantastic point that, the language of liberalism was most evocative in struggles for minority rights, whether it is from blacks or women or, Dalits in India or wherever. And that's absolutely true. Where I think that, it's not to me just about the means, but there is also an issue with the language in which some of this is framed. For example, when I think of wokeism, what I think of, and people will of course object to the use of the term, but just bear with me for the way that I use it and I define it. I think that wokeism begins where liberalism ends. Liberalism is all about individual rights, individual agency, individual autonomy of everyone, no matter who you are or where you're born. Whereas wokeism looks at the world through group identities and through a prism of oppressed and oppressor, and it becomes dogmatic about those. Those markers of identity which you can do nothing about tie you down to a narrative of either victimhood or oppression. Whereas liberals would hold that people contain multitudes, individuals contain multitudes. I am not just a victim, I am not just an oppressor. And in either case, my behavior should define that, and what has happened to me should define that, and not, an accident of birth, as it were. And when you carry on that language, it's like Marx's language of class warfare carried over into this particular battle. Then the backlash comes from there. And I'm being explanatory here, not justifying
Right.
the backlash at all. I agree with you on every margin about the vileness of the alt-right in America, and the dangers that it poses are far greater than any danger from elsewhere. But I just feel that that is also an issue, that the language of fighting for empowerment of any group, and you can think in terms of group and you think in terms of broad description, but when it comes to prescription, I'd rather think in terms of individual rights and frame it that way, because that is a language which kind of, succeeds in the end, that can get rid of the divides rather than deepening them.
I mean, I partially agree with you and I partially disagree with you. This was actually in the conference, in the final panel between Frank Fukuyama and Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Frank makes the distinction between there is nothing wrong, there's a good kind of social justice and a not good kind of social justice. The good kind of social justice is if you've been oppressed as a group, right, and it is your certain characteristics of your group that have been the grounds of your oppression. So whether it is your women or whether you are trans or whether you are gay or whether you are black, if you've been oppressed socially because of these things, then you have got to mount a movement, right, based on that identity. There are no two ways about it, right? Like, I mean, Gandhi created an Indian identity to fight against the British because the Indians were being oppressed by virtue of their Indianness. So if you are being oppressed by virtue of your identity, you're going to have to push back against that and form a movement. I mean, blacks couldn't have won the civil rights struggle or made advances in the civil rights struggles without coming through together as blacks and then inviting other groups, within that struggle. It doesn't have to be an exclusive. It couldn't have won if it were an exclusively black struggle, yeah, right? I mean, it needed the buy-in of the majority. But to show what your plight, you have to appeal to certain group identity. The problem comes, as Frank said, was when you start to essentialize that group identity, what you're talking about,
Which is,
right?
I actually
Yeah.
agree with everything you said.
Yeah,
You
right.
have
Like,
to,
yeah, you have to come together, right? Like when that identity becomes your sole defining feature, and that's when it becomes a problem. I mean, I'd even go further. It is fine to fight racism by appealing to your group identity. The problem is when you want a regime of anti-racism, right? Then you are trying to use the power of the state not merely to push back the existing structures that are oppressing, you as a black or a woman, but you want counter structures to oppress the other groups, right? That's when it becomes a problem, when you have a regime of anti-racism as opposed to a regime of racism. I agree with all of that. But I also think that's been highly exaggerated. And I don't think, I mean, I have profited greatly from critical race theory. Like if you look at what they are saying is, there is this whole controversy and discussion about structural racism in this country. What they are saying is you need a different vocabulary to understand understand what is systemic racism, your vocabulary of individual rights, and is not going to get you there. Yes, blacks are formally free in this country, right? But yet there are so many legacies of structures that we have that still keep blacks in a marginalized state, despite sort of like formal equality, which your language of rights can't get to. You need something else. And I think to that extent, they are correct. We ran this piece at the Unpopulist by Fabio Rojas, who is a professor at Indiana University over here, where he tries to describe, the truth about structural racism, and he compares it with crony capitalism. Now we all know there is such a thing called crony capitalism. You may have, this country may in principle have a commitment to free markets, but we know special interest groups in a million ways, tip the playing field in their interests. And it's not easy to push back against long-standing, kinks in this field. And he said similarly, it's in the social playing field. In the social playing field, for instance, to give you a simple example, there is Richard Rothstein, who's written a book about how federal housing policies in this country after World War II, so this is not like way back when, required a formal segregation for giving loans to developers. If black families wanted to live in certain housings that these builders were making, this was, for veterans, for blacks who were returning, they would not be given a loan. Now, that led to completely segregated housing, with blacks unable to form the kind of like capital, and equity that white families have been able to form. And those kinds of, that lack of human capital and the lack of actual financial capital is still plaguing blacks, no matter how much, formal equality you may have. Now, in such circumstances, if all you are going to attack in this country is affirmative action, because it's giving blacks some little preferences without addressing this very, big systemic inequalities, you are going to end up with a more unequal structure, right? That's the critique of critical race theory. So I think we need to, even when we talk about liberalism and individual rights, they don't capture the full story. I mean, that's a little piece of the puzzle over here, but we need to engage deeper with this critique, that the left is offering us here.
I agree with pretty much all of what you say. I mean, see, I consider myself, unapologetically a feminist. I hate racism, casteism, etc. But I arrive at all of those from the liberal position that all human beings are equal. We have agency, we have autonomy, we must be treated equally by the state and by others, and so on and so forth. But, Frank's point also, and he's written a book called Identity on this,
Yeah.
is that essentialism can often go too far and verge into caricature to the extent that whiteness is equated with white supremacy, that Savarnaness is equated with oppression automatically, and that kind of caricature, I think, has gotten some kind of pushback. And even great black scholars like Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, Glenn Laurie, they've also spoken about all of this, and I think they'd
Yes.
agree with the dangers of essentialism in this regard. But I don't want to belabor that point, because broadly I think we agree exactly. Perhaps the extent to which we need to argue about the means is
Yeah, the means, but I also think, I mean, there is the theoretical critique of wokeness and kind of like this essentialism, and then there is the practical, reality, and how this critique is used to discredit even legitimate claims and legitimate causes. That's the part that I worry about. I mean, in principle, I agree with it. So to give you another, I mean, you brought up Coleman Hughes, right? So you know about George Floyd's killing,
yeah.
right? George Floyd was killed by a white police officer, Derek Chauvin. And this happened in Minneapolis. there was this, this footage which clearly showed Derek Chauvin using, unorthodox,
Inexcusable. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very
the
clear.
maximum restraining technique against this man who did not pose any kind of a threat, right? And then Derek Chauvin gets convicted, rightly so. Now you have, and this is, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, and John McWhorter, all three of them started questioning. Well, first, Derek Chauvin gets convicted. A documentary comes out a few months later called The Fall of Minneapolis, where the claim was, and it was made by the wife of a police officer who was the head of the police union of Minneapolis, who had a rap sheet of police abuse, against him, or police brutality against him. And she makes this entire documentary based on conspiracy theories that Derek Chauvin was only convicted because he's white and there was no way he could get a fair trial in Minneapolis. And then she goes through some of the evidence, that was presented and tries to debunk it. This was very powerfully made. I mean, if you look at this documentary, on the surface, it seems plausible. The claims that she's making seem plausible. For instance, this maximum restraint technique that Derek Chauvin applied on George Floyd. In the courtroom, it was claimed that this technique is not taught, or so the documentary claimed, that it's not taught, and this was something illicit that he did. And she claimed, and she showed these manuals from the police department showing that this technique is actually, recommended and allowed, and he was doing this by the book. And so it turned out, it seemed like Derek Chauvin's conviction was just a political conviction. It was just, succumbing to the Black Lives Matter movement and defunding the police movement and the woke mind viruses, as Elon Musk would call it. Then Coleman Hughes writes another article. This was in December, basically defending this documentary. This was a very controversial documentary, defending the claims of its documentary. Some of my former colleagues from Reason magazine also then, buttressed the claims of Coleman Hughes. My other friend, Radley Balco, who's a criminal justice reporter, he did a 30,000-word rebuttal of the claims of this, of the movie. He showed how Derek Chauvin had been, not only got a fair trial, but a beyond fair trial. So it wasn't like they couldn't get an impartial jury, the jury had rightfully convicted. But here you have like these very respectable, very smart people falling for a narrative that is coming from a certain anti-left, anti-woke mindset. Just because the wokes have now become a, enemy in their own right, and even to the extent that even the legitimate issues and claims of, justice for blacks are now being filtered through the prism of woke demands, so that it's become harder to deliver justice. So there is this certain distortion of politics that has happened, where it's not just about the means that the progressive left is using. It is their basic claims, even when they are correct, are constantly being questioned. So anyway, so it was, so yes, there is essentialism, but sometimes what is claimed as essentialism is not really essentialism. It is actually a pretty legitimate demand, which is now being ignored because we've got this critique of the woke left, which can sometimes be true.
So, I mean, I haven't followed this particular, all of these writings in the documentary. I'll link them from the show notes. But here's sort of my follow-up question, that one trend that I've noticed in modern times is that our sense of reality has gotten more and more into silos that have nothing to do with each other. Like 30 years ago,
Yes.
you have a broad consensus on the
Yeah.
truth, right? You can disagree on the margins that, okay, the Wall Street Journal is a little bit right and
Yes.
the New York Times is a little bit left, but there's a broad consensus on the truth. And, no one would argue that if a person is skilled in that particular way, it's just wrong. Then you don't have to, think about which prism you are coming from, etc., etc. Though the whole O.J. Simpson thing also pointed to how people can look at something in completely different ways and just believe they're completely right. But leaving that aside, what has happened in modern times is that the mainstream has splintered. There is no consensus on the truth. We all have the means of production. We can all become warriors on whatever media we want to be warriors on. And I worry about this like in an Indian context. And an example I often use is that imagine you're a 15-year-old kid in a small town. You get your first smartphone. A friend of yours sends you some rabid right wing video, right? Full of hatred of some kind or the other. You watch that video and then the algorithm takes over.
Yeah.
Because you watch that, it'll give you more videos of that,
Right.
and soon that is your entire universe. And it is natural for you to then believe that everyone else on that other side is evil. You know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but I think that's true for, I mean, there are two dimensions of this, right? Like one is people who are merely consumers of information. I think they are getting segregated like this totally. But then there are the producers of
but
information,
my,
right?
my point is that even the producers, especially the younger producers, could also be true believers in whatever there is.
No, sure, but they could be, and I'm sure they are. But there is something beyond that, right? Like Glenn Lowry, to his credit, to go back to this, to the documentary, after he saw Radley Balco's 30,000 word rebuttal, he took back his claims, right? So reality and facts still manage to penetrate, through to some people who are not completely idealized, have become completely ideological, right? So there are still people who care about facts and truth and, are trying to get to the bottom of these issues in good faith. But there are too many producers who are just completely cynical. And and that's, I think that's kind of where the problem arises. They know what, sells. So Tucker Carlson is a perfect example of that. They know what sells, they know what people want to hear, and they will find a way to give it to them, regardless or not whether it has any resemblance to the truth. So there has become so there's an audience capture on the part of the producers, which too is, there's sort of like
It's
this
a vicious
it's
feedback loop.
a feedback loop, right? So, people want it. You've got these bad faith actors, who don't care about reality, who produce it, who give it to them, and it feeds on itself. And the more they get captured, the more it happens. And too many of our knowledge industries are caught in this feedback loop. But one thing that really just stuns me about the America sort of media industry, if we want to call it that, is in India India with Modi, there was this whole critique of you've got this laptop media, right, which will do his bidding, say whatever he wants it to say. And that's because he actively went about trying to control it. He put his loyalists and his cronies at the head of every media house. Now, the American traditions of free speech and free press are too strong for that kind of strongman takeover, right? And yet, I think the problem is worse in America, where because of and this will cut against your and my market sensibilities, where precisely because of market pressures, there is this emergence of this whole crop of populist influencers who have voluntarily, of their own accord, without actually Trump asking them or any other populist figure asking them, have emerged to give him what he wants. So you had Fox News after the last election. But this is an example I use all the time. So the election happened in 2020, and Fox News had this brilliant program which could predict which state was going to go for whom. And they called Arizona for Trump. And the backlash from within Fox executives was so great that the man who made the call was fired from Fox. Tucker Carlson went absolutely crazy saying, you are not giving our audience what it wants. And, so you had this media entity, which instead of competing, that like getting a scoop on something like this is kind of like journalistic. That's what journalists live for. But this whole sort of like practice of like, competitiveness, getting to the truth fell by the wayside. And you have this media arise quite spontaneously from the ground up to cater to the public that wants a strongman figure like Trump without any actual ask from Trump himself. Now, this is an extremely dangerous situation. And there is, I'm not sure what the solution to this is, except that you build counter, institutions and counter narratives, and you try and peel off people slowly into the sane, camp. But when you have such a fundamental breakdown, and your ordinary checks and balances are not working, your competitive, urges are not working, I don't know how you deal with this problem.
In India during the emergency in 1975, L.K. Advani famously said about the press that they were asked to bend, they chose to crawl,
Right.
right, on their own,
On their own.
without being asked.
Yeah.
And and it's been a
But
particular.
at least there was a threat there, right? Like there was a threat that she'll come after you. Like she will
Correct.
stop your. There is no threat in this country.
So
That was the difference.
So let me come at my question, but first, even about India, it's always been constant in the sense that one of those two deeper problems I spoke about, state power, is one of the reasons that this happens. For example, especially with the big media houses, you might have a big media house, you've got one of the big daily newspapers, you also have a chemical factory. The enforcement directorate could raid you there, and this is like real stuff I'm talking about.
Right.
This shit happens all the time. So the power of the state, and it's been wielded throughout India's democracy, not just in the emergency. Like just two examples from two different political parties over the last 15 years, where Chidambaram got Raju Narisetti out of India. Raju Narisetti was editor of Mint. Chidambaram had him kicked out, and a few years later, for the other next government, Jaitley had Bobby Ghosh kicked out of the Hindustan Times,
Yes.
where he was editor. He was doing this hate crime
Yeah.
sort of counter, I think, and he got kicked out, and it's a deep problem. And speaking of America, so here's the thing: at one level, where you stand depends on where you sit.
Right.
People will respond to incentives, and I can completely understand that people will respond to the market incentives of whatever the tribalism of the time might be. At the same time, the only incentive you respond to isn't money. It's a little simplistic to say that that's all there is to it. You and I don't do what we do because of money.
No.
Right? Whatever our incentives are, and we are, of course, also self-interested, but we might be driven by other things. Now, this is a question I want to ask you about journalism itself. That I've often felt that there is a dichotomy. That on the one hand, journalism is a kind of supply responding to demand. That there's a lot of information out there and there's a demand for it. You want to make sense of the world. So journalism should both provide you an account of what happened, the first draft of history, and hopefully separately in its opinion section, analysis of what's happening and why. And that is, one way of looking at it, that these are your incentives, your supply responding to demand, and you have to make a profit for your shareholders. That's also part of the game. That's one way of looking at it. Then there's an idealized way of looking at it, which is that you have to speak truth to power. That you have to, all these are cliches, but comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. And more, I wonder, how does one think of journalism and therefore justify what our purpose is? Because whatever that I have done, I've been really fortunate through my life that I haven't really had a huge issue making money doing what I do. But it's been driven from somewhere else. But, so what do you think of the fundamental purpose of a journalist, and how has your view of that changed over the last 15 years? Because I am guessing, and certainly that same process has happened with me, that I would say that there are far less people who are true to whatever their original stated values would be, and those were just window dressing.
Yeah, I mean, but that's always the case at any. I mean, people are imperfect. They are in something for all kinds of different reasons, opportunism, fame, money, what have you. But somehow, the industry was just kind of able to manage all these motives and generate a healthy product, so to speak, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong in wanting fame and, and wanting to be an investigative journalist because want fame. But that's not all you want, right? I mean, there is some broader commitment also to just basic fundamental principles of human principles. You want to be a truth seeker, you want to live a life of personal integrity. So even though you want to be get famous by doing like Arun Shourie did, right? Like, I mean, he inspired so many, young Indian journalists at that time to kind of like, yes, like, let's find corruption. There is some idea that, we want to do something good, like produce something of social value. That part has broken down. I mean, that connection between personal, motives and doing something, that's socially valuable, that seems to have broken down. I mean, now what you have is, with players like Tucker Carlson, who is now hobnobbing with Putin and Russia, and he is the most popular, guy on Russian state TV. I mean, what are they about? Somebody like Tucker Carlson doesn't need money because he's heir to a very rich, family. Um, he's already quite famous, right? Like, so why would he want, what is he after when he is becoming Putin's lackey, spreading bizarre conspiracy theories, questioning the institutions, of liberalism in a destructive way, and just riling up the public, right? Like, what is, so I don't know. Um, there's just some, there's just something so cynical going on in the American media. I really don't think it's that much in the Indian media, right? Like in the Indian media, they are responding to incentives, and part of the incentives are like the fear of, what state power can do to you, right? Like and if you don't play if you don't play ball, Modi will get you removed or your institution will shut down. None of that is happening in the United States. Newsmax, Tucker Carlson's channel, all of these are just spontaneously generated to just, feed something perverse, for the public. And I don't know how to explain this. I frankly don't know how to explain this. There is just a certain kind of nihilism that has set in that can't be explained by any rational motives that I can think of. I mean, and I keep coming back to Tucker Carlson because he's a very, interesting case study. He used to be like on your and my camp on questions like immigration, right? Like, he thought immigration had made America great. Now he has like the worst nativists, but beyond that, even, nativists have a point. But it's not just nativist theories that he's trucking in. He's trucking in like the great replacement theory, that this is immigrants are being brought over here as simply a ploy to replace the white population and,
Increase the base of Democratic voters.
increase the base of Democratic voters. You and by actually telling falsehoods, given that they can't vote. Once you get immigrants over here, illegal immigrants can't vote. They can't even get legal status. They don't pick. I mean, like, and it's not just Tucker Carlson. Elon Musk has been spreading great replacement theory. I don't understand what Tucker Carlson's journalistic motive is in any of this. What is he trying to accomplish over here? I have no good theory for it. I have no good
I
explanation
mean, I
for
don't think
it.
it's journalism, so we can't look at journalistic motive. I think it's just he's raising his status within his tribe enormously, and that can be.
But what tribe is this?
This is a Trumpian tribe. This is a MAGA tribe, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is. But to what end? I mean, he's already, he was a big name. He could have got status in some other way, right? He didn't have to go there. He didn't have to engage in conspiracy theories. He was already a big name.
Do
So
you
what is it? I mean, is it? I mean, like, I frankly, I don't understand it. Like, he was big already.
a question I often ask myself about many of these people who seemed to be sensible but then went completely, jumped the couch, like Arnab in India, for example, who was
Yeah,
sensible once, right? I've,
right.
I've been on his show in
Yeah,
2009, 2010. He was okay. And then they jumped the couch
yeah.
completely. And what I wonder is that are they doing it cynically, knowing that they're doing all of this to achieve XYZ, whatever that might be? Or have they become true believers? Are they really deranged? Do they believe that we are the deranged ones? Like, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. And, you also posed it as a rhetorical question. What
Yeah,
is driving him?
right.
It's just bizarre. We
It
don't
is.
know.
I don't think people can live with so much cognitive dissonance that they can actively believe one thing and preach something else, right? Like, I think, your sort of like your mind will disintegrate. So I think you do have to, at some level, just for your own sanity, integrate your two sides. So I think they do end up believing some of what they are saying. I think Tucker Carlson has changed his mind on immigration. Whether or not he fully believes some of, the crap that he peddles, I don't know. But I think he's probably changed his mind. I don't know. Maybe he genuinely does think that the left is such a huge problem in this country that defeating it by any means necessary, even mobilizing, the sort of like the populist furies in the worst possible ways, is kind of like justified. I don't know. Maybe he believes those things. So maybe he does think there is a social value to what he's doing. It's just that social value is different from what you and I would consider to be valuable, right? But it's possible. But what I find bizarre is that, I don't know Arnab's story that well. I mean, I think one element in Arnab's story may be that he is courting favor with Modi when Modi was at the peak of his power because he wants some, material favors from Modi, right? That's not the case with Tucker. You know,
I
Tucker
think
is doing it for some existential reasons I don't get.
I think beyond the point, many of these lapdogs have done so well for themselves that I think it's not even material gain. It's something else, whether it's status within the tribe or whether once you are down that path, you just go all the way. I mean, I don't know. It's an
But see, but
interesting.
Tucker, but it also has costs, right? I mean, there are reputational costs. I mean, Tucker is now not taken, considered a serious journalist anymore. And does that not, matter to him? And the tribe that he's become a part of, it's an intense tribe, but it's in some ways a smaller tribe than the tribe of, a lot of sensible people. And so I don't know even if like this tribal affiliation theory completely explains the Tuckers of this, Tucker Carlsons of this world. I just think there is just some deep cynicism and indifference and nothing matters. I mean, there is, something about, they're testing sort of like like this whole will to power theory. Like, truth doesn't matter, reality doesn't matter. You can construct your own narrative, and you can, come to power through the construction of this narrative. And I think Tucker did actually, want to run for president, but now he's discredited himself so much, I don't think he will. So I think Tucker at one point was just testing this kind of like this will to power theory. Like, let me construct my narrative. Let me see how many people will, fall for this narrative, follow me. And then let me see how much power I can get through this. So there was just, something like that going on. That's actually my best explanation for the Tucker Carlson phenomenon, given that there are there is no kind of like external pressure that is pushing him to do this. It's all coming from him internally. It's some internal motivation.
And extreme movements often end up eating their own. Like, you can't ride the tiger, so it'll be interesting to see what happens to him. But let me throw a theory at you and see what you think about it. I've believed for a long time that a lot of the political discourse is polarized because you have vocal minorities on each end, on both the right and the left, who are saying crazy things and who are shouting everybody else out and canceling everybody else. But there's a silent majority, which is not that wacko, which knows that there is nuance to every issue and the world is complex and you've got to be broadly sensible. And that's a silent majority. And my hope is in that silent majority that whatever may go wrong with the wackos on each end, the silent majority will eventually remain in its senses. However, a counter view to that could easily be that, hey, the vocal minority is not a minority. In some cases, it is a majority. Like in India, for example, there definitely is, a very large sort of very large social support for Hindutva. That's no
Yes.
longer deniable.
Right.
It is out there.
Right.
So, what is your sense of that in general and in America? Like when I look at it from a distance, when I look at Twitter and when I look at the news and I read your media, it seems to me that, oh my God, that MAGA is huge and wokes are huge, but maybe they are actually made out to be bigger than they are and they're not really that big. And you just mentioned that Tucker's tribe isn't really as big as he thinks it is. So what is your sense of that? That, has American society gone nuts, or are they broadly everybody sensible? It's just these movements that are, you know,
So, I mean, I've been writing a lot about the American right? And I think in the American right, I really do feel that for a period after sort of, World War II, during the height of the Cold War, a, s- a sensible kind of conservatism emerged that managed to tamp down some of the reactionary elements that were always there in the US, right? Um, Whether, sort of the Bircher Society, which was believed that there is going to be one world government, there is this cabal of world leaders who are just going to come one day and dissolve the United States, and there's going to be this one government. I mean, really crazy conspiracy theories these guys believed in. There was a great deal of anti-Semitism, lot of racism, um, Jewish conspiracy theories, protocol of Zions. I mean, these were all part and parcel of the right? I mean, there were, we think in India there is a big irrational, population which believes in all kinds of, gods and miracles, and India is, of course, a cornucopia of conspiracy theories. I can't talk to my mother about anything without her explaining the world to me through 3 conspiracy theories, right? But there was that in the US too, and I think a responsible conservative movement arose for about 50 years and managed to control it all. But it managed to control it, but it couldn't make it go away, and it was also doing business with it. So it was, the Bill Buckleys of the world were Bill Buckley is the man who's credited for purging the Birchers and the conspiracy theorists and the outright racists from the conservative movement. But at the same time, given that they are the ones who are looking, to National Review, his flagship publication, for answers, he has to also cater to their concerns, right? And he would do it in this half-hearted way, give them, if there are racists, he'll give them half a loaf, but he will make affirmative action, which was a huge part of this crusade against the civil rights movement. So he can't really, for instance, claim that there is no racism. He can't claim that blacks haven't been given the short end of this stick. But now, by golly, if you have a few, preferences in universities for blacks, well, that is a big violation of liberal principles of individual rights that we can all get behind, right? And so he was trying to develop this, movement of majoritarian grievances, but which was still somewhat respectable and kind of moored in, liberal traditions. But that was not going to satisfy them forever, right? And I think conservatives were hoping that they could engineer some kind of a soft landing, that over a period of time, you give the majority some share of legitimacy by acknowledging its grievances, but then you also keep moving, but you don't question the fundamental structures of society. I think all of that has kind of like that contract has broken down, and the asylums, the inmates have taken over the asylum. So the people that the conservative elite were trying to control are now making their bid for power. And so I don't know whether they are the majority or the minority, but they are a sizable force in American politics right now. And what is giving them more force is that there are people, you know, even respectable conservatives who have catastrophized the threat of the left so much that they feel that now to kind of like rebalance the forces, they have to ally with the right. So I don't know, like, I don't know if like the numbers tell the whole story over here. How much, sensible, not sensible. There is just this sense that, you know, America is at the brink because of these excessive demands from minorities and a leftist establishment that is constantly giving them aid and succor, and they control the commanding heights of all the cultural institutions. And if we don't push back by any means necessary, even if that means employing conspiracy theories or putting a strong man in power, we just have to do what is necessary to push back against this massive tide. So I mean, it's hard for me to quantify how many people, but they just are such a sizable force in American politics right now.
That's actually a scary narrative where, if I can paraphrase, what you essentially said is that for 50 years, the Republican Party was really elites managing primal passions, and now it's elites riding primal passions, making
Yes,
that
very
shift.
well put. Yeah.
And that's just incredibly then disheartening and dangerous.
Yes. So, right. If you look at the vote share that Trump gets, right there, it's about not quite 50%, it's less than 50%, but that's a huge number. Now, he has put together, not all of them are as crazy as him, but they clearly think he's less crazy than the other side. And that's the scary part.
When I look at both these sides, one question that I have is how much of this tribalism is driven by what you're against rather than what you're for? Like, this was a question Akar Patel, I'd done an episode on Hindutva with Akar Patel, and Akar had raised this, and it's a great question. And he said that, okay, you can speak of the Islamist movements, but you know what they are for, right? The Hindutva movement, you can, they're just against stuff. They don't
Yeah.
want love jihad, and
Right.
basically anti-Muslim. They're just against stuff. What do they actually stand for? Which is unarticulated and dangerous. But what I see even here is that a lot of the passions that are whipped up on the basis of what you are against, where a lot of the right, as you will say, will talk about the danger from the left, and a lot of the left will again define themselves as what they are against, whether it is in abstract ideological terms of oppressed oppressor, or whether it is particular dangers. And so, does the MAGA right what do they stand for?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I think the Hindutva right actually does stand for something, right? Like they want a Hindu nationalist country. They want a Hindu country, right? Like, so it's very clear what Modi's agenda is. He's an ideologue, right? Trump is not in that sense. He doesn't really have a clear
I mean, he's kind of
agenda.
incoherent. It's almost like, yeah.
Yes, yeah. He's got no real ideological commitments of his own. He's in it for power. But the people around him and the right-wing movement that has emerged around him, does have an agenda. And it's not an agenda which is internally coherent. There are many contradictions within this movement that he has created, but each one of them wants something that is actually understandable. So I wrote this piece called "The Taxonomy of the New Right," right? And where I identified 4 different strains that are powering, essentially Trump and the MAGA movement in America right now. So they all come under the national conservative umbrella. They're called the NatCon movement. But but it consists of many different factions. So one faction is what I call the Flight 93ers. I don't know if you're familiar with this essay by Michael Anton, who's a political theorist at Claremont, or he wrote this essay for the Claremont Institute. And he comes from a school of thought which is called the West Coast Straussians. My husband is an East Coast Straussian, so I know something about this school. And the West Coast Straussians are big sort of they love America. They love the American Constitution. They love, liberalism, right? So the question is, how can people like that throw in their lot with somebody like Trump, who's kind of like the anti-liberal, right? He wants to tear down every institution in America. And his story went something like this. He said, he wrote this essay called Flight 93. This was before Trump. It actually shifted, the right-wing intellectual class, which at that point had been ambivalent about Trump. He got a sizable number of conservative intellectuals move into Trump's camp after he wrote this essay. And his basic critique was that America is no longer a liberal society because it's been taken over by, the left, which sees it just as oppressive, misogynistic, patriarchy. And they have no love for America and its traditions. And so they are the true liberals, and what they need to do is just smash down the system, tear down, all the institutions of America, and then rebuild America in a truly liberal mold, where individual rights are respected, nobody has any special privileges, nobody has any special advantages. And they saw Trump as an agent of just tearing down the system because he was unapologetic towards the political correct orthodoxy of the left. And they just saw him as opening the space for their agenda. Right. So that was one faction. The second faction was the integralist faction, which is I think you heard this term a lot in my conference, right?
Yeah, but give me the context.
Okay.
Yeah.
So integralists it's a small movement of Catholic intellectuals, right? And their quarrel with America is completely different from the quarrel that the Flight 93ers have. Their quarrel with America is, in fact, its individualism. Their quarrel with America is that, the radical tradition of individualism that Locke has unleashed in this country is what is leading to this liberal progressivism, where you've got the sudden, epidemic of trans rights, and men want to cut off their penises and women want to cut off their breasts, and they want to turn into each other. This is because of the radical self-definition that Locke put in place by pushing his doctrine of individual rights. They want to turn America to sort of like the 17th, 18th century puritanical traditions, pre-liberal traditions, where you had thick-knit communities that controlled individuals and provided them with a certain traditional morality that they all had to hew to, right? So they think that liberalism in itself cannot sustain itself because it needs these pre-liberal traditions, of virtue and community and what have you.
But coercively enforced and not voluntarily chosen, as Locke would have said.
Right, yeah. So, but they don't think you can have communities that can simply be voluntarily created. You need, pre-liberal arrangements where people are part of a very strong community, right? Like, the Amish community in America, right? Like they have very close-knit traditions. There is not much disagreement allowed, and everybody lives for the community. And those communities, they believe, breed virtue. They give you a sense of a moral compass, and they keep individuals in check. Individuals don't go haywire with their self-definition. And so they want to return America to this pre-liberal state. So whereas the Claremonters is what the Flight 93ers are called because they come from Claremont Institute. The Claremonters considers themselves liberals. the integralists are pre-liberals. Then you have the national conservatives, the umbrella group. National conservatives want nationalism. This is kind of, I think, where Modi fits in.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
this movement was founded by actually Israeli intellectual whose name is Yoram Hazony. And he thinks liberalism is essentially an imperialistic doctrine because it judges all countries by one standard of liberalism, of individual rights and human rights. And it doesn't allow nations to have their own principle around which to organize itself. So his view is that whatever the dominant group in a country wants, however it wants to define a country. So if India wants to be a Hindu country, it should be a Hindu country, and liberal societies have no leg to stand on when they judge India. So if Israel wants to be an affirmatively Jewish country, then it should be allowed to be a Jewish country. And this whole idea of like equal rights for everybody and what have you is just liberal imperialism. It's just hegemony. Now, this, interestingly, is a critique that the left used to make about liberalism, right? I mean, if you and I are old enough to remember the days of the anti-globalization left, right, when they were saying liberalism goes around homogenizing local cultures and doesn't give them enough agency to define themselves, well, that critique is now coming from the right. And then you have like this fourth faction, which is the red-pilled bros. These are the anarchists, and they think that they believe in certain kind of hierarchies of merit, right? They want the world to be ruled by those who have any claim to sort of merit and set the rules for everybody else. So it's kind of like a Nietzschean kind of like worldview that, the super smart and the super rich and there is kind of a real sort of like toxic masculinity side to them, where they think male power should be venerated, and it's masculinity is a virtue, and that so male strength is a superior force in society and it should be allowed to order society. So they are very anti-feminist. They are very sort of anti-minority rights. They think natural hierarchies should rule the world. So if there is, if certain races are less smart or if they are weaker, physically weaker, well, the smarter races and the stronger races should rule them. So they want sort of like a certain natural hierarchy of merit to rule the world. Very Nietzschean. All of these are now part of the right, and they are all behind Trump. And you can, in the Elon Musk is firmly in this fourth camp, this Nietzschean camp. And so what unites them all? Now, they have very different ideas about how society should be ordered, right? So what is uniting them right now? Mainly the left. They see the left as an obstacle and the liberal left as an obstacle to all of their demands, right? Like they are the ones, the progressives, who are championing the causes of minorities or women and are preventing this principle of, natural virtue to rule. Progressives are the enemy. Progressives are the enemy of, Hazony's project of muscular nationalism, where the majority gets to define, what the cultural rules are and the political rules of any society are. The integralists, the Catholic integralists, they want a pre-liberal society. Well, who is against a pre-liberal society where witches are burnt at the stake because they don't believe in your, Catholic principles, and apostates and heretics are, not tolerated? Well, it is the leftist liberals. And then for the Flight 93ers, the Claire Monsters, it is just that, leftist demands have gone haywire. They don't like America. They consider it a sexist, racist country. So they too are against the left. So the uniting principle for all of them in America is the, liberal left is the enemy. And that's basically, there's nothing else to unite
Except the
them.
liberal left isn't liberal in the way that we are
Well,
using
but no, but
liberal.
I would be a lefty for them, right?
For them, you and I would be
We would be
lefties,
lefties for them.
but that's because that line shifted for them. We are where we are.
We are where we are, right?
Mm.
But as far as they are concerned, anybody who stands against this project is a lefty. So if I think there is something to structural racism, right? Like there are things we need to clean out in this country for true equality, that puts me in the woke camp. I've been been infected by the woke mind virus, as Elon Musk would say it. So we are all enemies for them.
So this is like a really wonderful potted masterclass for me because I didn't know these four categories kind of existed. And when I think of them the way you've described them, it is very clear that the second, third, and the fourth, at least as you define them, I don't know if the fourth would define themselves like this, but going by the way that you described them, are just deeply fundamentally anti-liberal. The first I find very interesting, the Flight 93 Years, the Claire Monsters, because it seems that what is truly anti-liberal about them is the means. That their end is something that, one can argue about or one can agree with, but it is a means. And I feel not enough people pay attention to the means, that the means matter so freaking much. The means are the whole deal. You cannot
Yes,
be liberal if you
exactly.
don't want to use,
Right,
if you want to use.
right.
And that is something that I simply cannot grok, that how can you say that it is justified to support Trump in all the incoherence and all the madness, if you want just to achieve some end which may lie somewhere in the
Because they
distance.
just think that liberal institutions in America, and this is Enlightenment liberal institutions in America, have become so fundamentally corrupted and co-opted by the woke left that they can't be saved anymore. And you just have to tear them down and begin again. So they want, they want like a renewal, after burning down the whole system. So they, again, like think about this, the echoes of the left, right? Like they hate the system. Who used to hate the system? In the 60s, it was the left that used to hate the system. I don't know. I mean, maybe you're not old enough, but I'm old enough to remember, we were all against the system, man, right? That's what oppresses us. And, the Vietnam war protesters in this country were against the system. The students were against the system. They were, the system was the oppressive force. And now, that critique of the system is coming from the right, from at least in this case, the Claire Monster right. And so, so they just think that the forces of liberalism have become so out of whack because, in this case, not Enlightenment liberals, but the progressive liberals have taken over, that there is no hope of saving America by playing by the rules, by just using standard liberal means, elections and courts and laws and legislation, and they don't think it'll work.
Forget the system of the country. What about our systems? We need a break as well.
Yes, yeah.
So let's take a quick break and then...
Many of the things I have learnt in my life, I had to learn on my own. I think you'll agree with me that our education system doesn't teach us so many things that we need to make the most of ourselves in this world. I learnt my lessons when life happened to me and I happened to be paying attention. For many years now, I've been thinking, what are the essential life lessons that everyone should learn to be able to live a complete life? I invited my friend Ajay Shah to join me on the intellectual challenge of figuring this out, and then we decided to put together a course where we would actually teach this stuff. So we created Life Lessons, which you can check out at lifelessons.co.in. In this 5-week course running across 5 Saturdays, we have put together 15 webinars that are intended to help launch you down journeys of discovery. We will speak about learning how to learn, learning how to think, mindsets, mental models, clear writing, how to communicate better, quantitative intuition, probabilistic thinking, the history of thought, the foundations of economics, and even practical matters like how to think about personal finance and how to think about personal health. People who do the course also get to be part of a larger community that will have in-person meetups once a year. Basically, while we've always been sharing what we have learned in a piecemeal way in our show and our writings, here and there, diffused, this is an effort to synthesize our knowledge for you. So please head on over to check out Life Lessons at lifelessons.co.in. Never stop learning.
Welcome back to the Scene and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Shikha Dalmia, and this time I want to, leave aside these problems we cannot solve like America and India, and instead I want to talk about your own life. So tell me a little bit about, where were you born, around when were you born, what was your childhood like? Give me a sense of that.
Around when were you born? I like that because I'm not going to.
You did a little while back in the previous part of our conversation. I think you dismissed me as a young buck and said you're not old enough to know. So we have
Or
already.
maybe you are, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was born in New Delhi and grew up there, went to college there, Delhi University, studied biology and chemistry at Hansraj College, Shah Rukh Khan's old college. So I take great pride in that. I love Shah Rukh
Were you
Khan.
there at the same time?
No.
He came after you.
Maybe I'm not answering that.
Yeah. Foiled, but I will keep trying.
Yeah. And then I actually worked in Patriot, which was a Marxist or a communist newspaper, national newspaper in New Delhi, based in New Delhi. The reason, I mean, even at that time, I wasn't a socialist, I wasn't a Marxist. I was actually had already my gateway drug to where I am today, although I was Ayn Rand for like a lot of us, like Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead, had read Milton Friedman. But they, like a good entrepreneur, you seize the opportunities that come your way. And Patriot was assembling this team of cub reporters. And I joined it. And Gauri Lankesh, I should back up. So I was in this Institute of Mass Communication program where Gauri Lankesh was with me. And other, people who then went on to do great things in Indian journalism. But anyway, so I got my start in Patriot. And this was at the time when Indira Gandhi was prime minister, and then within a year, she got assassinated. And the Sikh pogrom happened. That actually, the Sikh pogrom to me, which I didn't fully process at that time, but I covered it, right? Like I covered it for Patriot. And I went to a lot of the shelter camps that had been opened for the Sikh survivors. And I talked to them, heard their stories. And at that time, I don't know, I was too young and I didn't fully process what the significance of that moment was. But I think to a very large extent, the reason I have kind of like landed where I am and the reason why I'm so concerned at a current moment is that, I really feel that civilization teeters on the brink of utter savagery and barbarism, and you never know when things can go wrong. And I, couldn't have, thought that the Sikh pogrom, the way it happened to people whom I knew, who were being targeted, who were being harassed by other people whom I knew, could ever, I didn't think that was possible. I was young and innocent. And to some extent, I think my whole political, intellectual growth has been grappling with that single episode that I covered for Patriot at that time.
Did you feel it at the time?
No. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I felt it in the sense that, there was something happening, but I didn't understand the true magnitude of it and what it represents. From a human perspective, from a political perspective, from the standpoint of, just kind of what it means about human nature and how quickly people can turn against each other. I don't think I fully understood any of that at that time. I think now I'm beginning to, literally. And then I came to the United States. I came here for graduate studies and started a PhD in communications with a minor in political theory. Never finished it because I got a job at the Detroit News editorial page, which was too hard to refuse. My son was just born at that time, so it was just too much going on. So I'm a proud ABD, all but dissertation.
Yeah. Tell me, tell me about let's rewind and take me back to those growing up years because I'm very curious about the forces that shape a person into who they are. And life back in those days, and in this sense for both of us, we could essentially be the same generation in this regard, that we are growing up in the pre-internet years, the pre-globalization years. So you have a limited number of books that you have access to. You have a limited a number of thinkers you have access to. How do we look at the world? Often there is a default look, that a default frame that we adopt from whoever we are with, our families or our friends or whatever. And then over time, we add little bits to it, little bits to it, little bits to it, and it kind of grows from there. And when I think of myself at 20, I knew nothing. My beliefs were just incoherent, random, all over the place. I was reading Marx also. I'm proud to note. But and over time, then a more sort of systematic shaping can happen. So what was that like for you? Like for you, tell me a little bit more about your family growing up. Where did they come from? What were their worldviews? What was a mahal, as it were?
So that's a big question. So, I was raised in a Punjabi family in New Delhi. My father was a refugee from Lahore after partition. He was, he after partition, after he came to move to in the Indian side, he went to med school in Amritsar, became a doctor, and we lived in a joint family at first with his with his brother and my grandparents. And at some point when I was 8 or 9 years old, we moved into our own family. But it's hard to know for oneself to actually disentangle all the cultural and the political influences that one was exposed to. But they were, as all sort of refugees of partition, they were traumatized by the partition, right? So we had a lot of like family lore of what it was that they encountered as Hindus in Pakistan, and the dire conditions in which they made their escape from Pakistan. My uncle, he was in that train, that famous train, which was in E.M. Foster's book, The Passage to India, right, where there was a complete slaughter of all the Hindus that were trying to escape, and only a few survived somehow. My uncle was one of those, right? And so there was always, so I grew up in the lap, I guess, of Hindu nationalism in a way, that because I was hearing these stories about Muslims are capable of anything. They will slit your throat at the next, at any opportunity when it serves their purposes. And at some point, it dawned on me that Muslims are telling the same stories about Hindus because there were atrocities on this other side too. And my mother, who was on the India side of Pakistan, actually recounts the stories of atrocities against her Muslim neighbors by the local Hindus. Like her neighbor was this Muslim family, 8 daughters. My mother had six, there were 6 siblings. And she had a friend in this Muslim neighbor who was exactly her age. And at one night, the local sort of like the Jat brigade came and decided to kill all the Muslim families in the area. And this Muslim neighbor family was completely annihilated, right? My mother's friend was killed along with her grandmother and mother, and I mean, like, everybody was just completely savagely killed. And so so at some point it dawned on me that both sides are telling each other these exact same stories, demonizing each other, and there's something fundamentally wrong about this. At the same time, my dad was a musician, by night, doctor by day, and he had these very close friendship with his Muslim musician friends. He would sing with them, he would, break bread with them, he would love their biryanis, So there was also this, at a human level, there was this relationship. So I guess I had these two, the human framework to choose from and the political framework to choose from, and I chose a human one. And so that was, just at the level of basic sort of politics, right? So that was my orientation towards this Indian liberalism, accepting diversity, accepting religious differences. I guess I got that from my Hindu nationalist family in some weird kind of way. because human beings are complex. As you said, they have multiple identities, and those identities don't fit well together. They are contradictory, and they can behave really well at one time and really badly at another time. And I saw that all in front of my eyes. And at some point, I guess it's just a choice you make, right? Which side you're going to identify with. A lot of my cousins have gone in the other direction and have become fairly dogmatic Hindu nationalists after Modi. But then, that's one side of it. But the other side is, I think I always felt extremely stultified by sort of like conventions, not of India, but of any traditional society. The extent of control that it has to impose on your agency, the way it shapes your choices, the way it closes off certain opportunities for you just by way of convention. Very early, I had decided that the arranged marriage system was a really terrible system and dehumanizing to women and men, and I was never going to have an arranged marriage, and I never did. So there was also this revolt against, conventional Indian traditional society and its stultifying, demands that I was grappling with. I used to, as all of us in that age, right, we used to read a lot of British literature. And you could tell that even though we were reading British literature from like a century ago, right, like Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy, but they were still talking about some of these social problems that we were encountering in India at that time, right? Like Jane Austen's books are all about arranged marriages and how do women make their choices between the set of structures that they, that are imposed and they have to choose from, and how do they maximize their agency. But Jane Austen also has a critique of all of that, even as the women are trying to negotiate and make their choices within this stultifying system. But she also takes a step outside and critiques the society, and that gives you a vantage point to critique your own, right? So I think all of that was like a huge influence, just reading this English literature. I had a Somerset Maugham. I used to love Somerset Maugham. I don't think I like him that much anymore. But, we read all of sort of English literature. And then, on economics, but we were also in a middle-class family that was aspirational, trying to get to the next level, right? Like trying to build a comfortable life for itself and encountering the difficulties that all middle-class families encounter in India. And so that also, raised all kinds of questions of why is it so hard to get ahead? Not that I was thinking that we are not getting ahead, but I could see, my dad worked hard and, we saved money and there was always a financial constraint and we didn't know what we would do after we finished college. There just weren't that many opportunities for us, right, at that time. And I read Ayn Rand, and then, she's got a critique of like conventional demands on an individual. She's got like the whole free market thing and free enterprise. And she obviously hit me like a ton of bricks. And Milton Friedman, who helped me make sense of why Indian socialism doesn't work, was hugely influential. But that was really the extent of my reading on economics till I came to the United States. And in the United States, this is an interesting story, I guess. I was in Louisiana State University where I got my master's. Louisiana is a southern state in here, antebellum South, font of slavery and really, heinous practices against blacks. And my professor over there, who became my mentor and took me under his wing, his name was John Calhoun Merrill. So he was named after one of the most famous and vicious segregationists in the South. But my professor was this Southern gentleman with not like a racist bone in his body, and just intellectually, he had written books about this was in the journalism program, and he was asking big questions about journalistic ethics, the different kind of models of the media, the Soviet model, the American model, the BBC model, their, virtues and vices, pros and cons, their ethics of journalism. And he was asking political questions through kind of like this journalistic framework, but he was also extremely well-read beyond journalism, and he introduced me to Hayek. and to von Mises. And when I left, he was about to retire, and he gave me his entire library of his books, which had Ortega y Gasset, it had Nietzsche, it had all the Frankfurt School thinkers, Adorno, Horkheimer. I mean, like, he gave me all of it. He was hugely influential because, he introduced me. Not only did he open my eyes to the conversation about journalism in America, but he introduced me to Hayek, which to me has been my most, important influence intellectually. So anyway, I think I got carried away here, but I went to Michigan State University for my PhD, started at the Detroit News, worked over there for about 15 years, till actually a very liberal publisher took over the organization of the paper and wouldn't let us do the critiques of like socialized medicine and the welfare state that we wanted to do. And so at that point, then I quit Detroit News and I started at Reason magazine, where I was for 15 years till I branched off on my own.
So, lots that I want to double click on, and I'm particularly struck by, the early family background where, your parents and that generation of your parents is all from partition and they carry that with them. And I'm struck by how one responds to that sort of generational trauma. Like a story that moves me deeply is Yogendra Yadav's dad. I think he had family members killed in partition. And then he chose, when he was naming his son, he chose to give him the middle name Salim. And I think that's such a beautiful
Very beautiful.
story,
Yeah.
and how
Right.
you kind of deal with that. And no surprise that Yogendra Yadav has been attacked by the right for having a Muslim middle name. But when you hear the story, I think that is everything that is sort of beautiful about India. I did an episode with Achal Malhotra a long time back. She'd written this lovely book on partition, about memories of partition, of people who experienced it and the objects they carried over. And while researching for the book, she traveled to Lahore or Karachi, I forget where, and she met with this family which had crossed over and seen all the violence. And at one point, this family was recounting their stories and saying, "Oh, Hindus are like this, Hindus are like that, Hindus are like this." And then they notice Anchal is sitting there, and this lady just turns to her and says, "Tum nahi beti, tum achhi ho." And I got to thinking
Yeah.
there about how different things are in the abstract and in the concrete.
Right.
That in the abstract, notions like nationalism and race and purity can really divide us. But in the concrete, even the greatest of bigots is very often someone who is completely assimilating, in the food that we eat, in the clothes that we have. So I thought of this when you mentioned your, dad having musician friends who would be Muslim, and be completely chill with them. And that is sort of the concrete side of
Right.
it,
Yeah.
that you're actually sitting face to face with a person, then you cannot hate him. It is absurd.
Right.
Which is why people behave in social media in ways that they would not behave in the real world.
Right.
Like just the rudeness of a snarky
Right.
quote tweet is not something you'll have a real world analog of. And I wonder that in modern times, as we get more and more driven into our silos, as we spend more and more time looking into the black screen in front of us instead of going out there. Yesterday, I was, recording with Arnold Kling, who spoke about how when he was young, they'd always be playing out in the street, and now they are not. Kids are not doing that anymore. So, do you think that that is something that one should worry about? Not in terms of passing judgment, ki, oh, this is bad, our days were the best. Not in that way, but there is something beautiful to people coming together, spending time with each other, which is why I would imagine that there would be less hatred and discrimination in cities, for example, which would tend to be more liberal than rural areas, whether it is in America or India.
Right. Absolutely.
Even
Yeah.
though urbanization is never a panacea, obviously. So, what is your sense of this?
No, I think you are absolutely right that when you think of a group as an abstraction, you have one set of attitudes towards them. When they are living, breathing flesh, and you can see their virtues and their lives and their aspirations, you have a completely different attitude. And I do think that our current moment of this polarization that we all live in is definitely driven by the fact that we've been siloed by the digital virtual world that we live in, because your interaction with actual human beings is just that much less, and so nobody's ever humanized you. It's always an abstraction in your head. I mean, I think that very much explains the left-right divide in the United States, because the right doesn't actually meet people on the left who are living, breathing humans, and vice versa, right? And so it's possible to keep this sort of like these demonized versions in your head. It's not, and it doesn't, I don't know, it sometimes happened to me even in other dimensions, right? Like a friend whom I haven't seen for a long time, right? And I only see her social media posts, and I form a certain view of her in my head, because I haven't had that rich, direct connection with her. And then we sit down and talk, and I realize how much more complex her thinking is, how much more there is to her as a human than one little Facebook post that pissed me off, right? Like, so that part is definitely there. On the other hand, I also think, and the Sikh pogrom is testimony to this, evidence of this, is we can also like overdo how much humanization there is possible when you absolutely consider a group to be an enemy. I think there is a certain barrier that cannot be overcome, and you can live with it in a compartmentalized reality up to a point, but when something in the outside world triggers you to triggers something and forces you to take a side, that human side can immediately fall by the wayside. And just to go back to the Sikh pogrom in New Delhi, I told you I studied botany and chemistry at Hansraj College. So I was covering this, this episode for the Patriot. And my assignment was go to the university, and because universities were my beat, and just write a story about what do people in Delhi University think about what's happening. So go to interviews with some, anybody, and write a story. So I went back to Hansraj College and I talked to my botany professor, and his last name was Tandon. I don't remember his first name. And it turned out something I never found out because I never had any occasion to find out, but he was a real sort of like the RSS kind of Hindu nationalist guys. And he said to me, they have killed our Hindu leader about Indira Gandhi. So this is kind of like just to show you how much the Hindu mindset has changed too. Like at that time, Indira Gandhi, who was a Congress, party prime minister, but she was seen as a Hindu leader by BJP. BJP didn't exist, but, RSS, Jansangh, these forces. He said, the Sikhs have killed our Hindu leader. We should kill them mercilessly. And I remember being like just sitting in like shock at him, that this man who was giving me knowledge, right, like teaching me botany, and comes from like this, decent, solid family man who's got his own children and family to protect, is perfectly okay with the absolutely unspeakable atrocities that have just been perpetrated against Sikhs. There was no digital world at that time. We were not siloed. There was a whole lot of exchange. I mean, Hindu and Sikhs were very intertwined communities, right? Like there is intermarriage of a kind between Sikhs and Hindus that has actually never existed among Hindus and Muslims. They just considered, two sides of the same broader family. And yet there was this turning. So I don't know, so I think there is something to the sort of like digital age and the sort of the atomization that it breeds, but I don't know if it can, it explains everything. I think there is just some darkness that lurks in human beings that can get triggered at any time. And that's kind of what spooks me about our current moment.
No, I mean, the banality of evil is ubiquitous. I didn't mean to say that, I just think that digital media may enhance it or exacerbate it, but it is unquestionable that at any moment we are on the brink.
Yeah.
The barbarians within us.
Yeah.
If you and I start having a fight, we could
Yeah.
like start killing each
Right.
other. Though it's your study, so you know where the
Yeah.
kirpans are hidden.
Yeah.
as
Well, lucky for you, I'm not a Second Amendment nut.
yeah, that too. Yeah, who knows? And it's interesting, I never thought of it that way, but I did an episode with Veer Sanghvi once, and he'd just written a really nice autobiography, and he told me, and political scientists seem to sort of all back it up, is that the 84 election, which Rajiv Gandhi won so comprehensively, was the first real expression of the power of the Hindu vote. And the
Yes.
BJP was actually founded in 1980 under quote unquote to follow Gandhian socialism, and they'd gone down some other route. And it was in 84 when they realized that, oh my God, there is this massive Hindu vote out there, and we should have gotten it, but we are nowhere in the picture. And they completely pivoted and they went off in that direction.
Yeah.
And Rajiv Gandhi did Shah Bano and all that, and
Yes.
didn't realize what was happening, and sort of the tiger kind of begins. And let's go back to your personal journey. I'm also curious about what about the discovery of Hayek meant to you, and reading Hayek much later in life in my adulthood, in fact, meant a lot to me as well. And I think of all my learning or all my arriving at where I have arrived as a series of light bulb moments. Like, a light bulb moment could be when you understand the positive sumness of things because we are wired to think in a zero sum way, or you understand spontaneous order because we are wired to think of top down, that control mindset. Or you realize Hayek's great insight about prices, that essay, The Use of Knowledge
Yes,
in
that
Society,
was my favorite, one of my favorite essays. Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Tell me, like, what did you read that suddenly, what were your light bulb moments? What made you sit up and go, wow, this is amazing?
So the use of knowledge in society, that definitely was a light bulb moment for me. You know, Hayek was not a beautiful writer. He was not easy to understand. And that essay, didn't make a whole lot of sense the first time I read it.
He had this complex Germanic prose style.
Yes, yeah, right. And turgid and, convoluted sentences and, what have you. But I guess I was grappling with questions of, whether socialism works or not at that time. And this whole idea that what socialism needs is a single mind to contain this, you know, this very, very complex sort of disparately held, nuggets of knowledge. That was just very powerful to me. That was, he made 2 points. One, that no single entity can keep all this complex social knowledge in one place. And, there is just no such computer path. That was very important to me. The second thing was, but the more interesting insight to me was about how entrepreneurs use the knowledge of their time and place to their advantage. And only they can have this knowledge. It's tacit knowledge, which can't even be communicated to this central authority, right? So if you shut down the price system and the information that prices convey, you basically cut off the ability of entrepreneur to act on his local knowledge. That to me was a very central insight. And that part of it was really important to me in my sort of journey about politics and economics. So I could understand, why a centrally planned economy simply cannot work, but also why an attempt to centrally plan it would be so, violent for society. How much of the natural animal spirits of people it would have to thwart in order to put itself in place. So the damage that it would do to the natural social, institutions and civic society, that was, super, super important for me. And what I liked about Hayek was, unlike sort of, and with all due respect to my son, who's got a PhD in economics, and he's much more of a mainstream economist and does econometric modeling and all that. But what I liked about Hayek was precisely that he was not in this mold of, quantitative neoclassical economics, who was trying to prove his insights by, demand curves and supply curves and, all of that, and equilibrium theory and all of that. It was all there, but he was really more a sociological thinker. He wasn't trying to prove economics at a mathematical level. He was much more sociological, beginning with just a study of like human nature and observing living human beings, just engaging in commerce and economic activity. So I liked his style of thinking, that sociological style of thinking. But then I think the other essay of Hayek that was deeply influential for me and is to this day is The Road to Serfdom, right? Where that is a psychological book, right? Like, and it just shows you why in an authoritarian system, the worst get to the top, how their internal incentives are completely structured in such a way that if you are a decent human being, you will just not be able to survive in that world, right? And so you will, by choice, bow out. Whereas it is really like, the people who are inherently capable of doing horrible things will be the ones who will rise to the top. Now, that book was written against, of course, socialism and socialist planners, but it actually also applies to any kind of
Speaks to the current
authoritarianism.
day.
It speaks to the current day. It actually, Jacob Levy, who was at the conference, he's been struck by how many people who swear by Hayek's book when it comes to socialist central planning forget about what he was really talking about was, fascism. He was saying that socialism can be the road to fascism, despite its good intentions, because of the people who rise to the top. But here comes Trump, and they forget about that, and they take the shortcut to fascism, right? Like, as if so. So Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and I think also the other part of Hayek's views that really, this I guess I had to grapple with a little bit more, given, my rebellion against, traditions and conventions in India, was that traditions contain in them a whole lot of knowledge. And, they are a crystallization of like wisdom of the times, and you shouldn't be too cavalier in how you jettison them. That too, that was a bit of a harder, that what was his formulation? They are of human mind, but not human design.
Yeah, I think that's
What was
Adam Ferguson's words, that human action but not human design.
human action and but not human design, right? And that was a deeply, that I had to grab. And not just that, but he also said that the human mind can't rationally comprehend the wisdom in a lot of these traditions. So and that part that, you can't comprehend rationally what's good about these traditions, because they are crystallization of very complex trade-offs over a period of time. That, I think, was the hardest thing for me to accept, but I do see the wisdom in it now.
I think the normative element there wasn't that you should maintain all traditions and not think about them, but that you should be careful about just tearing down
Right, and he
traditional,
was
because
right. And, I call myself a Burkean progressive now, which is basically, it means that I'm progressive in the sense, I'm almost like woke, in the sense that I think we do need to think through all kinds of, bad traditions and structures that
but that's liberalism itself.
redound to the disadvantage of one group or the other, and we need to rethink them. But I also think we need to do it slowly and incrementally, and not just kind of like in a revolutionary way. And
I would say that's not woke, that's liberal. Woke would be that if you were to think people of a particular group are just evil just by virtue of birth.
no, but in the
That's
sense that things like structural racism exist.
Hmm.
Right, like I buy that. I think the structural racism does exist in India. You can formally there are no castes, but there are these entire systems, informal social systems that maintain the caste discrimination. So it's baked into the structures of our head. It's baked into our daily practice, how we interact with each other
I
in
mean, not to go
India.
back to that, but I'd say the way out of that is
No,
liberalism and
no, I
always has been.
100% agree with that.
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, I 100% agree with that. But I'm just saying that, you know, uh, uh, acknowledging that these structural discriminatory structures exist is no way to say that liberalism can't help you get rid of them, but it does suggest that we have to deal with them. And we can't deal with them just by granting everybody individual rights. Something more needs to happen over there, right, before you can address
But to
them.
get back to your
Yeah. So I'm a Burkean progressive for that reason, because that's one reason I'm a Burkean progressive. But I also think, going slowly helps you separate out the just claims of,
mm,
oppressed or marginalized people from those perhaps that are not so just of any group, right? And so everybody is capable of making inflated claims about their oppression and what have you. And I think you need a sorting out mechanism. And so if you go a little bit slowly, give society the time to, chance to deliberate, I think you get better outcomes. So in that sense also I'm a Burkean, but a progressive, because I think social justice is an important cause.
one formulation I arrived at for myself over time is when I thought of the people who are my heroes in the Indian freedom movement, and they're really most of them 19th century people like Gokhale, Ranade, Agarkar, Nauroji, and I think of all of them as people with liberal ends and conservative means. That they wanted a more liberal world with more freedom and etc., but they didn't want to break everything down and get there. Their means were sort of
Yeah.
much slower, deliberative, consultative, and this frustrated a lot of the radicals later on because they
And
were like,
rightly
"Hey,
so, right?
yeah, because ki petition करने से कुछ नहीं होगा तुम्हारा. You have
right.
to find a different way to fight, and I
Yeah.
guess for different times, different sort of means.
Right. And I think it all depends upon how big is the injustice that you are dealing with, right? When you are in the Jim Crow South, where blacks are facing discrimination and oppression and lynching and violence beyond all measure. Like, I can see a very robust social justice movement saying, we do not want to live with this for even one more day. I mean, and at that point, I really give credit to the whole crop of black leaders who emerged, in those 100 years and counseled both the white, activists and their own people to work through the system, right? I'm not sure I would have if I were I was a mother of a black kid who I was afraid made one wrong move and a mob would descend on him, right? Like, I'm not sure I would have put up. I mean, there are times when I think some amount of radicalization is good, and I think it should be proportional to the injustice that is being that you are trying to deal with. I actually think in India there are certain caste practices which call for much more radicalism than we are seeing in India right now. I mean, I think there really needs to be, working through the caste system in India is like, you'll wait centuries. So I would be in favor of a little bit more radicalization in India.
I mean, I think the most radical thing that actually help people of lower caste empower themselves was the 1991 liberalization.
No, absolutely.
Like
I mean, yeah,
hundreds of millions of people came out of poverty, and obviously this included many Dalits and many people from various castes, and ultimately only that empowers you. That is the greatest empowerment, prosperity itself, and
No,
I think
I
that we
completely
need
look.
more of that radicalism.
Yeah, no, I completely, like, agree with that. And ultimately, caste is a complicated thing. It's partly caste, but it's also partly class, right? Like, and a lower caste person becomes wealthy, and suddenly,
I mean,
their
nothing is
caste ceases to matter.
nothing is a panacea. I'm not saying either
But
prosperity or
right,
organization are panacea, but
right,
they make a difference,
they
and we
make a
should.
difference. That's my point. And and liberalization, even if it had continued apace and had lifted many more lower castes into the upper rungs, but still there would have been a baseline left that would have been facing massive injustices and discrimination. And, like, I mean, in India, there are villages where the lower caste people can't drink from the same well. They can't go to the same temples. They're still asked to wait outside. And it's not just in villages. It even happens in, cities, even in New
It
Delhi.
happens everywhere. It happens less in cities. It happens everywhere. But when you think about the roots out of that, I think by roots I mean ROUTE, not roots. Like caste is one of Hinduism's original sins, in my
Absolutely.
view.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrendous. But if you think of a root out, the root out is if somebody is oppressed, you have to figure out how do we empower them. And the only kind of empowerment which lasts and which can help people transcend those situations is always going to be prosperity, is always going to be,
That's
uh,
one
you know,
part of that, as you yourself say. That's one
it's not
part
a
of the
panacea. I
puzzle.
say it's
Yeah,
one part of
it's
the
one
puzzle,
part, and that's
but
fine. But I don't think it'll solve
of
everything.
course not. There's
And
no.
I think there needs to be a fairly, I think, sort of, I mean, not radical is not the right word, but a robust movement to increase sort of like the awareness of what it is that lower caste people and Dalits have to confront every day in their lives, in big ways and small, little indignities that we don't even think about. And they not only, and what makes it difficult is that they internalize their own sense of inferiority too. They know that, if you approach an upper caste person, you have to approach them in a certain way. And it's kind of like affected their own structures of their mind. And I think you need some kind of like
I
an awareness movement, a robust awareness movement to kind of like make people aware of it and purge this.
I did an episode with the great Dalit scholar Chandrabhan Prasad,
Yes, yeah.
and he speaks a lot about all these things that we may not see or take for granted. And there were many TIL moments in that episode. For example, he said that when he finds out that any elder in his family has diabetes, it's a cause for celebration for everyone. Because in an earlier age, they would never be overweight. They would, it's prosperity makes you overweight, that gives
Yeah.
you diabetes. So, so it's very counterintuitive and all of that. And Chandrabhan ji's sort of eloquent description of where he comes from and where he is, I think comes out most evocatively when he says that his two heroes are Ambedkar and Adam Smith.
Mhm.
And he says, Dalits
Yeah.
need them more and possibly the second
Yeah.
as much, if not more than the first.
Yeah.
So that's very
That's a
evocative.
beautiful formulation. And
Yeah,
right. Ambedkar
that's
and Adam Smith. Yeah.
exactly. And I'd say that it's a very complex society because what you also need to do, what I tend to do is that, rather than listen to upper caste voices, what are Dalits themselves saying? And when I look at what could be a proxy for this, in both the 2014 and 2019 elections, more Dalits voted for the BJP than any other party.
Yeah,
In
actually, I
fact,
have a piece coming out about in 2014 they did. 2019, it's a little bit more complex.
I mean, I had an episode with Yugang Goel who looked at the
Yeah.
election data and he says the same thing, kind of. A lot of it is, in fact, pretty counterintuitive. I mean, Yugang's argument is that the Hindutva vote is much smaller than people
Yeah.
think it is.
But
Which
that doesn't matter. I mean, look, Dalits, like anybody else, will
contain multitudes and have various
not just
interests.
that, but they will. I mean, the one thing that Hindutva did was construct a Hindu identity that included all the castes, right? So one of the things they were basically telling the lower caste were, well, you may be lower caste, but you're still better off than the Muslims are, and they were uniting them, right? So that was pretty like, that was part of it. But the other part of it is, I mean, I don't blame a lot of Dalits if, for voting BJP, if BJP is the one delivering social services and
Yeah.
welfare services, and they are just doing a better job than Congress I, because their, immediate needs are obviously going to be more paramount than some broader, aspiration for complete equality, which is not going to happen in their lifetime. So I mean, I get that, but but my thing is like the Ambedkar part is important too. Adam Smith can indirectly help to raise.
No, the Ambedkar
I
part
mean, to
is,
give you
but,
one little.
but I'm not arguing with that.
No, I know, but I'm saying, but I know you're not. But I'm just saying it's important to just keep that in the forefront. Yeah.
So, one tangential sort of thought that I have before we again get back to your story is about political language and a progress in the political discourse. For example, I feel great disquiet in many of the terms and the labels we use, right? Like when we talk of social justice, you and I agree that we need social justice, everyone would say so, but the way in which that term would be used has taken on different connotations and it doesn't always lead to social justice. Similar thing with liberal. You know, you and I use liberal in a particular way, which is broadly classical liberal, but equally when you were talking about your experience at the Detroit publication where you were, you said a liberal organization took it
Yes,
over
I know.
and
It's liberal is a very
you
confusing
used
term.
it in a different way. So
Right, yeah.
liberal is very complicated. Libertarian is not a term I use
Yeah.
anymore for myself because it's just become the tribalistic connotations are crazy. And at one level, at a personal level, it's very easy for me to avoid using any of these terms because they can mean anything and therefore they mean nothing. But at another level, how do we even talk to each other when we can't agree what words mean? Where
That's, yeah.
I mean, in India, of course, liberal is a pejorative, no matter what kind of
Yes,
liberal
right.
you are. So
Yeah,
that's a
right,
different
right.
problem entirely. So is this something you think about? Like, how do we think about language in that sense? Like, ideally, I would say that you forget whatever label you want to ascribe to me. Let's talk about values. Let's talk about ideas, and at least we're kind of clear where we are. But is that a problem in America? Do any labels mean anything at all? Like so many conservatives aren't conservative. So many liberals aren't liberal. Social justice, as many people see it, isn't social justice. It's the opposite. In India, labor laws hurt workers. So, what do you think about the evolution of language and how difficult it can be?
I mean, it is extremely difficult. And, the term liberal that you and I were just discussing, literally that term causes more confusion than, clarification, right? Like, and you and I who are plugged into the various meanings of liberal can flit from one meaning to the other and we'll still understand each other. But I can just imagine somebody who's not clued in, how will they ever follow a conversation like this, right? Like where the fundamental meaning of the term is constantly changing. So it is, a real, it's a very big issue. Um, and part of the issue I think arises is because when any particular term gains the moral high ground, two things happen. Either a whole backlash arises to knock it off its moral high ground, which to me is the honest response, because then you are making arguments against what that term stands for. But what creates the real problem is when those who are cynically, motivated try to co-opt the term for their own use and give it a different meaning. And I think that's kind of what's happened to the term liberal. At various points when, it's had the moral high ground, illiberals have tried to appropriate it. And that's created another meaning of the term than the true liberals. If you say Enlightenment liberalism, well, then you are mooring it too much in a sort of like a Western historical tradition. So that doesn't work. So I don't know. There are just no clear answers to this. And I think any word, any label is going to stick for only a particular or a certain amount of time before you have to move on to the sort of like the next iteration of that word. I don't think there are any easy answers to this. But what do we call that? Right? Like, how do we describe that? Because the term liberal has so many different meanings to so many different people. And so we were thinking of, okay, well, we should call it maybe classical liberalism. But, classical liberalism too has a problem because in that integralist world that we were discussing, the classical liberalism means taking the country back to like the 19th century, because that's kind of like, the days of the founding when slavery existed and other things existed. They, that's their idea, turning back. That's classical liberalism. For us, it's Enlightenment liberalism. For them, it's something else. If you say Enlightenment liberalism, well, then you are mooring it too much in a sort of like a Western historical tradition. So that doesn't work. So I don't know. There are just no clear answers to this. And I think any word, any label is going to stick for only a particular or a certain amount of time before you have to move on to the sort of like the next iteration of that word. I don't think there are any easy answers to this.
So tell me more about your journalism years. I've of course seen a lot of your work from for Reason and followed your work. I think for more than 20 years, but in various places. But what was the approach that you took towards journalism, and did your worldview play a part in it? Because you mentioned like when that Detroit publication was taken over,
Yeah.
you couldn't do the kind of stories you wanted to do. So you kind of so you moved away and you went to Reason, which was then an excellent publication, of course. Was part of your journalistic journey also shaped by the values that you came to believe in and the frame with which you saw the world? Was that an integral part of the work you were doing in a sense?
So, my journalistic journey is a little atypical in that I was a reporter, in the true journalistic sense, actually only in India when I worked for Patriot, which were great formative years. Actually, I was taught how to write by my Marxist boss in India because I was starting this section in Patriot on the science section that we called it, where I would go and talk to, researchers in Delhi, in various universities in Delhi, and come back and write these, pieces about their research. And it's extremely difficult to write about technical, scientific work in layman's, terms and make it accessible. And my Marxist boss used to tell me to go to the American library and read Scientific American because he said Americans had mastered the art of communicating science in an accessible English. So anyway, I was a journalist for a very, in that sense, a reporter for a very short period of time in India. I actually went into opinion writing when I started on the Detroit News editorial page, right? So I was just writing editorials and opinion pieces. But they were not kind of like the standard punditry where something happens and you kind of like give your gyan, like ye mera opinion hai. We were really doing policy journalism. So policy journalism meant that you really had to read, welfare reform. That was a big issue at that time. There was this whole critique of the welfare state, which I bought at that time and I still buy, about how welfare is breeding dependency among the very people it's trying to help, right? And there was a whole, great deal of truth to that. I would think about it slightly differently now, but anyway, then there were all these ideas for welfare reform. How do you construct welfare programs that deliver the aid but without the dependency? And there is a massive literature on that. So, had to read all that literature to, write stuff. So I was doing, on trade, on immigration, all of these areas, there was just a huge policy element to it, which, you just had to grapple with. So I cut my teeth in policy journalism. And that's kind of what I've pretty much done most of my life. Now I have veered away from policy journalism because I don't think policies are the issue anymore. I think you need to have like a stable, framework of, liberal institutions which allow you to have conversations about policy, and then whatever the outcome of those policies is, for that outcome to stick. If that basic framework is unstable and can collapse because the next strongman is going to come and change all your policies tomorrow, then all of this policy conversation is kind of like useless. So now I've kind of moved away from policy journalism to just kind of like more, trying to grapple with the more fundamental questions about politics and society. So that's kind of where I am, and that's where, the Unpopulist, this Substack publication that I founded, is. We do some policy journalism, but we are really trying to take stock of the larger political, social, trends in the world.
Let's talk about that. I mean, I want to talk for 5 more hours about your life, but we have 40 minutes to go, so we'll save it for some future episodes. See how cunning I am. I'm
You
getting
are.
a tacit agreement for a future episode. But uh, b- I think what is more urgent for us to talk about and more important in this current moment is the Unpopulist, the organization you founded, the Institute of Study of Modern Authoritarianism. But before we start talking about them specifically, tell me about that part of the journey which made you feel the need for these, which made you feel
You're a
that
troublemaker, aren't you?
I'm just trying to understand the world. You are part of it.
So, I mean, like I said to you, I came from the libertarian, I think it's fair to say I was never right, but libertarianism has been mostly on the right in America. So my entire worldview was kind of like shaped by a certain right-wing inflected tone, right? And and when I was writing for Reason magazine, I was doing policy journalism, but it was all within the framework of kind of how the right thought about certain policies. And sometimes we were pushing against kind of like the right, like for instance on trade and immigration, but sometimes we were agreeing with the right when it came to, say, welfare reform and, other things. And but the fundamental, issue for libertarians is the issue of state power, right? Like libertarians, I think, are the people who rightly put the problem of state power at the center of their political project. State power can be a force for good if it is limited and clearly constrained, and it can turn draconian and tyrannical when those constraints are removed, right? So guarding against state tyranny and tyrants is kind of like the heart of libertarianism in my view, and it is the heart of the liberal project also, but it's just one part of the liberal project. But what I discovered was that when Trump came along, like, you and I were talking, too many libertarians did not see Trump as the existential danger to liberalism or their own worldview that I would have expected. Right. Just to go back a little bit, I mean, conservatism in America the conservative movement in America emerged in the heyday of the Cold War. And it's famously been described by Reagan as a three-legged stool. You probably heard of this, right? Three-legged stool, which consists of neoconservatives who were kind of foreign policy hawks, so traditional conservatives who believed in American traditions, and then libertarians, right, like who believed in free markets and individual autonomy and what have you. And all the other two factions, the neoconservatives and even the social conservatives, actually very quickly spawned very robust Never Trump movements. I mean, like the biggest Never Trump movement right now is being powered here by the Bulwark, which is Bill Kristol's organization. He spoke at the time, right? They've become ardent anti-MAGA, anti-Trumpers, and robust defenders of liberalism and liberal values, toleration, pluralism, open society, And the traditional conservatives did so for their same reason, because Trump is nothing if not a finger in the eye of every traditional value, right? Like family values, just honesty, decency, treating people right. And so they spawned a Never Trump movement. The only faction that did not was the libertarian faction. There is not a single libertarian in America who is associated with the Never Trump movement, right? Like the closest is George Will, who writes for the Washington Post. He doesn't write for any traditional libertarian outfit. So that was part of like the need was that, libertarians who put the problem of state tyranny at the heart of their political project have largely sat out this moment, and they need to really dig into their own intellectual resources. I mean, John Stuart Mill has never been needed more. Hayek has never been needed more. John Locke has never been needed more. Hume, Adam Smith, all of these who have been canonical figures for us. And we are not really referring to their insights and their work to mount what is needed for the moment. So that was part of my project. And the other part of it was that simply, I think, all these various factions on the right that have emerged to push back against the excesses of their own side and defend liberalism are not working together, and they needed to work together. And that's kind of why I founded the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, whose the heart of whose project is to bring all the factions on the right and the left who are just defending fundamental liberal values and structures.
So tell me a bit about more about what it is set up to do. Is it an activist organization? Is it a scholarly organization that aims to understand what the hell is going on? You know, when you talk about modern authoritarianism, it's obviously a problem across the world.
Yeah.
So why did you set it up, and how did you then propose to go about, achieving what you
So
set out to
it's a
do?
very young institute. I only founded it in September, so it's not even like a year old, right? But so yeah, the reason it's called Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarian is to distinguish it from the old authoritarianism of the left, of socialism and communism, which preoccupied the 20th century, right? Those were the authoritarianisms that we were guarding against them. The 21st century authoritarian threat is a completely different beast. It's coming more from the right, and with some elements of like a fusion with the old left, but it's primarily a right-wing movement, and it's very populist in its tone. And in populism, something very strange happens. Whereas, in liberal democracies, we think of the people as a check to the power of the tyrant, because we expect them to guard their liberty in a zealous way. And so we think that, somebody who wants to come and repress them, oppress them, they'll rise in unison and check this tyrant. In a populist moment, actually the people become one with the tyrant, right? Like they think the tyrant is an extension of them. So we the people and me the people kind of like become the same thing. And so to the extent what we are seeing is like, this populist element to modern authoritarianism, it puts us in a very strange place, because one fundamental check to state power in the liberal polity is gone. And I think we just haven't grappled with that enough. So even though the Institute for Modern Authoritarianism will deal with all kinds of authoritarianisms, whether it is religious authoritarianism, religious nationalism, ethno-nationalism, this kind of populist nationalism authoritarianism is a big part of what it does. So the Unpopulist, my Substack newsletter is part of it, but the other part of it is that in America, we don't have any way to gauge public sentiment for the appeal of strongman politics. Like in Europe, they can form, because it's easier to form parties whenever a far right or a far left party emerges. You can count the number of votes it's getting over the years, and it'll give you a pretty good sense of, what is the appeal of this extremist ideology. In America, we don't have any of that because it's very hard to form third parties. So we are launching this polling project, which is constructing a model of populism, and we've got a very rigorous definition of what it means to be a populist, and we are conducting it nationwide. And what we want to do is establish like a baseline for the appeal of strongman politics, and then look at it over time to pick up these trends when they emerge, and so that we have some time to nip them in the bud. Part of the problem with Trump was we were all kind of caught flat-footed. We didn't know this appeal for a strongman figure like him was emerging when it was, and so we were caught by surprise. So we don't want to do that again. And this can, populism is an ideology that can emerge on the right and it can emerge on the left. I mean, neither side has a monopoly on it, right? Latin America's history is replete with left-wing authoritarian, whether it is Maduro or Hugo Chavez or, any of them. But populism, so we want to create like a neutral instrument that can pick up populism regardless of which side it emerges on. And so that's the other part of what we are doing.
So my sort of theoretical framework for understanding populism has really been Jan Werner Muller's great book, What is Populism? I did an episode of Everything is Everything with Ajay about that as well. We'll link it from the show notes. And he's, of course, given, the 7 things populists have in common is, number 1, portraying themselves as part of the common man. Number 2, anti-elitism. Number 3, victimhood, etc., etc. And so Ajay and I, on our show sort of spoke about what each of us considers to be fundamental to the populist appeal. And his opinion was that that fundamental aspect was anti-elitism.
Mhm.
And my opinion was that the fundamental aspect was actually simplistic narratives from which anti-elitism emerges. But simplistic narratives are appealing to most people because they don't require cognitive energy. They don't treat the world as a complex place. So, for example, in 2016, when Trump is talking about the loss of jobs in Middle America, it's easy for him to say that part of it is that your jobs are being shipped overseas, and therefore that's an anti-trade argument, and part of it is that foreigners are coming here and taking your jobs, so it's an anti-immigration argument, and these are completely wrong. But they are simplistic and easy to get behind and easy to rouse the masses. While anyone who actually tries to say that, look, it's deeply multifactorial and these are the structural reasons and all that, you won't get time of day. So that is Muller's framework and how I'm responding to it. Now, since you have obviously studied it in much more depth, what are your insights on populism? Like I'm trying to figure out the why in terms of why is there this appeal? I mean, the appeal for the strong man, I get it. In tribal times, we wired to want strong leaders who will, you want the most badass motherfucker as leader of your tribe, right? But that's just how we are wired. And I thought we've learned to pretty much fight that part of our
Right.
wiring. And clearly we haven't. But populism itself and the fact that, it almost seems to follow a template across the world.
Yeah.
Tell me your insights about what else you could add to Muller's framework and why you think it has the appeal it does.
So, I mean, Mueller was very interesting because actually, he challenged the idea that populism was essentially against elitism, which it is. He said populism is against pluralism, right? Like what populists don't like is a world of heterogeneity where different people have different political preferences for them. Which comes to your point of like a simple narrative, right? Like they want the world to be ordered in very simple terms. There are good people and there are bad people, and they are part of the good people, and all the others are, like bad people, right? So they want like they want a simplistic narrative, and it can be anti-elite versus the common man, the elites versus the common man. It can be pluralism versus the common man, because the common man, if the common man wants a dominant group to rule and marginalize everybody else, then they become anti-pluralistic, right? But there are other elements to I mean, the appeal of simplistic narratives is perennial. It's always there in politics. Whoever can come up with the best soundbite to explain a complex issue has instantly a head up, right? Like people here or in India don't have time to understand, the complexity of the situation. So I think that part is just kind of like baked into the cake. I agree with you. It's more pronounced in a populist moment, but there are other elements to a populist moment. So one is splitting the world into in-group and out-group, and the out-groups are the bad people, whether they are elites or whether they are immigrants or whether they are Jews or any kinds of minorities. And you want to structure the polity so that the in-group is favored and the out-group is, discriminated against or given the short end of the stick. The other element is, one man who personifies all your grievances. So populists tend to be, obviously majoritarian grievances movements, because they're not undemocratic. I mean, the thing to remember about populism is that it's not undemocratic, it's democratic. And the reason it is democratic is it wants it thinks it has the numbers on its side. Like that more people are for what they want than against what they want. So they want, so they want democracy, but they want pure democracy. They don't want the mediating institutions of a liberal society. They don't want...
They don't care about a republic.
They don't care... Well, not... Yeah, a republic and they don't care about the procedural elements of a liberal democracy. They don't want to have to go through parliaments and Congress to debate and discuss, so that minority viewpoints are also factored in and duly weighed in. They want majoritarian rule, and they want it because the numbers are on their side. So there is a great contempt for parliamentary norms in a populist movement, and there is a penchant for violence and conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories goes to your point about simplistic narratives. It's not only that their narratives are simplistic, they want boogeymen. They want like some sort of like group or cabal whom they can blame for the current state of the world, right? So that's the other element. So there are just these, so there's just the appeal of strongman politics, the out-group, in-group mentality, the appeal to violence, appeal to cultism, and complete contempt for liberal democratic norms and procedures. So that's kind of, for us, the formal definition of populism.
And is it the case that at some level that the political institutions and the design of the state that we have with us is an artifact that would have suited another time, but in light of what we know about the world is actually outdated? For example, the first past post-voting system,
Yeah.
right? If you didn't have it in India, for example, Modi would not have a majority. You would have a 30. And there's an ironic story behind this. I read an episode with the great politician JP Narayan.
Yeah.
And JP told me that he had once got every party in India circa 2004 or 5 to agree to shifting to proportional representation. Only one person held out, and that was Sonia Gandhi. And her thinking was that my party is in power
Yeah.
now. Why should I give it up?
Right.
Right? And you consider the irony of that today, where had she agreed at that moment in time,
Yeah.
this moment in time would not have come.
Yeah.
And obviously, there are many different kinds of proportional representation. I once asked this to Pratap Bhanu Mehta, and Pratap said that it would just exacerbate the differences between us and hardwire the sort of divisions between the different political tribes or the different kind of identity politics. So that's in episode 300. I'll link it from the show notes because I'm not sure I'm quoting him with enough fidelity or nuance. But my broader point is that the way the world is designed at any moment in time attempts to cater for how the world is at that moment in time. But the world has changed rapidly and is changing even more rapidly, and we are stuck with an old design that doesn't work anymore. So what are your thoughts on this, and what are your thoughts on how any change could even happen? Because the status quo will never allow for any change, obviously. If a populist is in power, he will never want to do anything that could hurt his chances the next time around. So how does one think about this?
So it's a good question. I think we have to, so I see my project, I mean, you asked about the Institute for Study of Modern Authority and what exactly are we trying to do. So we've got like a three-pronged approach based on different timelines: short term, medium term, and long term, right? Short term, we need to buy time against these, the populists, right? Who would, if Trump gets elected, he's got very grandiose plans of like completely redoing the government and the internal checks and balances on his power to get what he wants. And he will do it with great speed. I mean, they've got a whole agenda in place to fire 50,000 civil servants, replace them with Trump loyalists so that there is no internal bureaucratic check to his designs. And he will mess with the judiciary more, just as every authoritarian, Modi has done it, lowered the retirement age, Orban has done it, Poland, they did it. They will mess with all these institutions so that they work more in his favor, right? And so the first thing we've just got to do is just defeat them at the polls with, obviously legitimate means, not by stealing elections, but by legitimate means, but by making people aware of the danger of what they represent. Even if these are squeaker victories, we need victories against them so that they don't come to power. But at the medium term, we've got to fix these electoral systems. So first past the post system is a problem in America too. especially because it's combined with gerrymandering of districts, right? Like there are, I mean, right now the American elections are basically settled by a few districts in 5 swing states, which are still have some chance of going one way or the other. Everything else is already taken by one side or the other. So that can't go on. So you need to fix that, and there are many proposals right now being discussed. Part of it is the primary process in America is terrible. It leads to polarization because only the most extreme people, most mobilized people come out and vote in any party's primary, and they pick a candidate who represents them but can't win in the general election. And if they win in the general election, it's because the state itself is in a particular party's camp. So it's just leading to extremism. So we need to figure out like a way to reform this primary system. There is all this talk about ranked choice voting and fusion voting. So there are all these reforms that are on the table, and that's part of what we are trying to do is figure these reforms out. And they will have to, in the US, begin at the local level, because at the national level, one of the big reforms that needs to happen is with the electoral college, right? Which is right now, I think or Democrats have a point. It gives a disproportionate advantage to Republicans. They can win without winning the popular vote just because of the way the electoral college balance is set up right now. But Republicans are not going to change that, because why should they? It has an advantage for them. So it'll have to begin at the local level in small districts and work at the state level. That's a midterm reform. Or medium-term reform. The long-term reform is just a cultural reset. I mean, people have lost faith in liberalism. People, both sides feel like they are not being listened to, they are not being heard, and there is just this backlash against liberalism. So first we need to sort out the legitimate complaints from the illegitimate complaints, address those, and also remind people that there is no other system other than liberalism that will give them better results. I mean, Pratap, in his conversation with Frank at the conference, said it's not just liberalism that's in crisis. Every political system is in crisis. But we have an opportunity with liberalism to self-correct that you don't have in other systems, right? So the long term, there needs to be a cultural reset where people need to be reminded of everything that liberalism has delivered, which is peace, prosperity, end to all kinds of horrible, brutal, feudal, oppressive hierarchies. All of that, people need to be reminded of. And so we are we are not working at the first level in the sense that we are a nonprofit and we don't engage in partisan activity. But I think, populists have to be defeated wherever they are. But the medium term and the long term planks are what we are working on.
What do you think about the Republican Party per se? Because one way of looking at the whole Trumpian thing is that it is a moment. He is an old man. Eventually, the moment will pass and things could go back to normal. But the other way of looking at it is that there has been a fundamental shift. In fact, it will probably get worse because whoever comes next and takes over the MAGA movement could be someone who sounds perfectly reasonable from the outside, who may not be such an obnoxious person in the many ways that Trump is, calling Mexicans rapists, or the way he talks about women may not be like that. Maybe a family man and a complete gentleman and say the best things and control his rhetoric, but otherwise be as MAGA as Trump is, and therefore as dangerous. Right? So what is your sense of that? Like, where do you find hope from?
In some ways, I think America is lucky that it has this populist demagogue, but he's such an awful man that he mobilizes resistance as much as he mobilizes people on his side, right? Like, so I had written a piece when Trump first came along, and National Review, which is a conservative magazine, had done this episode called Never Trump, and where it had invited all kind of like luminaries within the conservative movement to write pieces on why Trump should never get elected. By the way, all those figures are now firmly within the MAGA camp, or many of them are within the MAGA camp. But they had done this edition, and I remember writing at that time, so much of it was just against the stylistic elements of Trump, his awful personal character, and his uncouth way of, addressing himself and his, manifest flaws of character, that I said, if he had been a more sophisticated political populist demagogue, who stroked his chin and talked about the American Constitution, but that, we needed a recalibration and, and had a better vocabulary to couch his agenda in, these very same people would have been in Trump's camp even then, right? Like, so in some ways, America lucked out that, with Trump, that he's such a low quality demagogue. But I think you are absolutely right that now that he has created a taste for certain kind of populism, this is not going to go away. And you're going to get a whole lot of political entrepreneurs who are much more ideological than him and have like a consistent worldview in a way that he doesn't, because he's in it only for the power, who can, mobilize this movement that he has created and use it for their own ends. And I think J.D. Vance is a perfect example of that. He's a very smart man, and he's got like a very coherent critique of liberalism, right? And especially of the open society elements of liberalism. He's married to an immigrant woman, but he thinks immigrants and trade are the bane of America.
He'd be from the NatCon wing of the...
He would be from the NatCon. Yes, exactly. He'd be from the NatCon wing, not the integralist wing, because he's a nationalist. I mean, he's got like this left-wing working class critique of liberalism, and he marries it with a certain cultural conservative critique of liberalism, right? Like that liberalism markets decimate local communities, and they create these, like individuals who are unmoored from any kind of a social structure, but then it doesn't provide them with enough jobs and enough wages and what have you. And so what you need is an autarky where you keep out immigrants who are challenging our way of life and challenging our jobs, and you need high tariffs to create like an internal, market that'll raise wages. I mean, everything we have fought against in India that had brought India to ruin, the autarky, the trade autarky, the import substitution approach, all of what we celebrated after liberalization, economic liberalization, it's back on the table now in America with J.D. Vance. And
It's back in India also now
yeah,
with
well, it's
Modi.
back in India also. Yeah, and it's back in America. I mean, he wants made in America. He wants. He doesn't want to do business with the Chinese. He doesn't want, Mexicans coming in the country and taking jobs. He doesn't even like the cultural influences that they bring.
I think it was you who tweeted today that he is not, J.D. Vance is not arguing against the Democratic Party. He's arguing against former Republican
Yes,
presidents.
I mean, he is not he's not indicting so much the Democratic, certain working class left. Like he says that, he finds much to agree with when it comes to Bernie Sanders and his critique of like America's market economy. He's on record saying that. His critique is of all the previous, the Reagan, post-Reaganite presidents who essentially bought that an open America, open in every sense, open to cultural influences, economic influences, doing business with the rest of the world on even terms. That's what he is, that's what he's indicting. And so there's already an heir to MAGA and much more, philosophically coherent. I wouldn't say he's got a good case, but he's at least internally coherent. And they're going to, and so that's where the Republican Party is going. There is no coming back for the Republican Party. And that'll obviously affect the Democratic Party too. So my fear is that, the Republican Party is moving the Overton window in the direction of like a closed economy and a closed society. And ultimately, Democrats are also going to follow suit unless we can really mount a vigorous reminder of what openness has achieved and accomplished and why it's worth fighting for.
It's such a sea change, Reagan's three-legged stool becoming this four-legged ass, where all the four
Yeah.
legs are completely different from
Yeah.
those three
Yeah.
legs.
Right.
And I often say of India that, people from outside, if they talk in terms of left and right, I say, look, in India, there's no left or right. Every party is statist and left-wing when it comes to economics, and every party is right-wing when it
Yeah.
comes to society. And they're just anti-freedom in every dimension. And over here, what it seems is that suddenly now every party is also statist.
Yes,
That,
it is.
at least in terms of economic freedom and markets, it's like completely gone out of the window, and I feel so sorry for you. I would tell you कि यार
I
भारत आ जाओ,
appreciate.
लेकिन वहाँ पे भी, so you please fight the good fight here. My penultimate question: if listeners of this show want to, support ISMA, support what you do, and the first thing I would tell them is just go and subscribe to the Unpopulist. A lot of great articles, great insight over there. So that's what I would recommend to them to begin with. But if they want to support you in other ways, such as financially, where should they go? What is a URL? Just
So, yeah, if they want to support me, unpopulist.net is a completely free publication. So they can just go on the unpopulist.net and just sign up. So, yeah, if they want to donate, they should go to ismaglobal.org, and there is a donate button on it, and they can donate. We
people will often listen to sort of episodes like this and they'll be like, huh, interesting abstract discussion. And yeah, why should I donate? Interesting apps. And I'm like, that no, this is not an interesting abstract discussion. We all have skin in the game. We all live in this world.
Yeah.
So let's do something about this. My final question for me and my listeners: recommend to all of us, books, films, music, which you absolutely love, which give you joy, so much joy that you want to share them with the whole world. And also, in addition to this, I might add books and resources that helped shape you and that you feel everyone should read is essential reading.
Okay, so the second question first. So we already went through, some of
The Hayeks
the
and
Hayeks and the Burkes and those. But actually, one of the really underrated thinker who I think we should all be paying attention to is Judith Shiklar. She came to the United States after World War II from Latvia. So she was kind of like lived at, a country which was on the fault line of communism and fascism, and she fled there. And then she went to Harvard, and she was a professor over there. And she wrote a very brilliant article called, what was it? The Liberalism of Fear, where, in my view, she presents a completely unique defense of liberalism that I had not seen everywhere. And her essential contention is that, liberalism is not primarily about creating a free and prosperous society, although it is that. It is not about giving people moral agency, which is what Kant wanted, like freedom of conscience. It's not that. It's not the million defense where you can all self-actualize and follow your bliss. She said all societies are based on some form of institutionalized cruelty, and the state becomes the enforcer of this institutionalized cruelty, except in a liberal state, where the liberal state's entire purpose is to systematically, remove these cruelties and to identify them and remove them. And so she said, she calls it the liberalism of fear, because the cruelty generates a certain fear in society that orders how people think, the way they move, the way they interact with each other. And a liberal society comes and systematically rolls back these structures of fear that have been created to control individuals and allows them to live their lives. But for her, the primary thing is reduction of cruelty. And she is a big believer in property rights, and not because she thinks property rights are good for the economy and they, you mix your labor in them and you create something, because she thinks property rights create a safe space from the state and from society, right? Like where you can be in this room, thinking your own thoughts. And so she's a big defender of property rights, but on very different grounds from which you and I have been, have heard. So I mean, if I were not running this institute and caught up in the day-to-day muck of things, I would devote myself entirely to reading Judith Shikha right now. So that's in terms of reading recommendations. For joy, I don't do much fiction reading these days, unfortunately, which I would love to. But I tell you, my go-to place for peace and sukoon is Sufi music. I love Sufi music. I love, all the Sufi greats, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, Rahat Fateh Ali Khan. In India, actually, the Indian music scene to me is like my happy place right now, because so much good stuff is coming from it, right?
Any particular
So
recommendations?
the Nurani sisters are great. I think actually the Pakistani singer, what's her name? Hadiki. She is fantastic. She sang that song Kamli, which I love. And so so Sufi music is kind of like, I think it's spiritual. It's there is something, it's spiritual, it's grounded, and yet there is a certain sense of kind of like takes you out of your own, like kind of like your body, and transports you to a different kind of world with a different kind of emotional experience, which I just love. So Sufi music, listen to Sufi music.
Sufi, so good. Thank you so much for your time. This was such a great conversation. You have already promised to have more conversations with me in future. So, good luck fighting the fight you're fighting. You're fighting for all of us.
You are fighting some great fights. Actually, I have to say this to you. The other day, about a year ago, when I was watching our side go to complete shit over here in the US, all my former comrades have gone off in directions I don't even understand. The seen and the unseen was my little ray of like sanity. Like, where we were still having the kinds of conversations I would want to have, but seem to be slipping away from because the moment has changed, and it seems almost like a luxury to be thinking about those things. But I was so glad somebody is still doing it.
Thank you so much. You're so kind. And if the world does go to hell, at least you and I can have a conversation right here in your room. Why? Because property rights.
That's right, yeah.
So, that's very profound, actually. I can't wait to read her. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will, do subscribe to the Unpopulist, the newsletter launched by Shikha on Substack. It's free. You can follow Shikha on Twitter at Shikha Dalmia, that's one word. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITBARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.